Hey guys, tonight we step softly into a cool corridor of time where lamp flames tremble along pale stone and the air smells like warm olive smoke and a hint of sea salt drifting in from somewhere you can't see. The fan above you murmurs like a tiny shoreline, the pull chain clicking once and then behaving. Your lamp lays a warm oval on the blanket and makes slow ripples over the blue of a paper map until the ocean looks almost wet. The cotton under your forearms is cool, smooth as evening water. The window frame ticks softly as if the night were adjusting its glasses. We are not actually climbing into a Bronze Age boat, no provisions, no sea legs. And you probably wouldn't survive this without a snacks and a sturdier jacket. But we are going to drift through rooms and courtyards and harbors until rumor feels as cozy as a quilt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is. I love picturing this sleepy fleet all over the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your fingertip strolls to the map's central crease and feels the paper warm under a skin, a tiny tide in a field of fibers. The lamp's ripple does its favorite moon path trick, sliding across latitudes with the confidence of a cat. The fan keeps the metronome shh, and the Atlantic becomes a library aisle, long, quiet, ready for browsing. You hover your palm above that polite expanse of blue where nothing is printed and everything is implied. No pins tonight, only manners. The outlines of continents look like careful handwriting you promised not to smudge. A steady fact arrives early and sits itself on the margin with clean shoes. The oldest complete account of Atlantis appears in the 4th century BCE in 2 dialogues by Plato, Timaeus and Critias, placing a sophisticated island beyond the Pillars of Heracles and letting it vanish in a single day and night. You don't need to argue with it yet. You let the fact cool on the page the way a loaf cools on a rack. From this shelf, we'll wander forward through other rooms that claimed to recognize a piece of the story: Egyptian courtyards that speak in shade, island palaces with stairs built for sea breezes, Phoenician harbors salted with resin and rumor, singers who park meadows past sunset, geographers who measure the blue, monks who write the smell of kelp, merchants who hear one bell offshore and swear it's history clearing its throat. The map has a weather of its own. Where your wrist rests, the blue warms, and then, when you lift it, cools back to library temperature. You think of drawing our destination as a tidy ring, just to please geometry, then decide against it and practice your degree in not touching fragile things by only petting the air. For your first soft joke, you imagine a sleepy app called Atlantis Finder that opens, says, "Have you tried looking under A?" and immediately falls back asleep. 5 stars for honesty and excellent boundaries. You trace the strait labeled with its heroic name and feel the paper give a minute shiver somewhere between a cartographer's hiccup and the sound of a sail choosing a side. Behind the walls, the building offers a single clunk from a courteous pipe, your favorite bedtime percussion, and then returns to a hush that the lamp translates into light. Somewhere, a refrigerator hums a low vowel that agrees with your fan, Everything practices being background so your breath can do its simple job. Shh. A less attested harbor rumor settles on the lampshade like dust motes that have opinions. Sailors along certain coasts swear that on very still nights a bell rings once underwater, a low, patient syllable, as if a drowned plaza were keeping vespers for fish. Charming, unverified, you shelve it beside the soft cinnamon thread that keeps sneaking into your evenings from someone else's kitchen, and you let the rumor do its real job, lowering your shoulders by exactly one notch on an imaginary tide staff. Historians still argue whether Plato's island is primarily a moral staging Athens opposite a boastful empire rather than a memory, and whether his famous 9,000 years traveled across languages as months turned into years at Sais, inflating the distance like a sail. They also argue how strictly beyond the pillars ties the tale to this particular ocean or to any coordinate at all. Tonight, you don't referee. You let the debate drift like fog off the chart's margin. Not a hazard, just a softener. Your finger pauses in the blue where blankness looks full of possibilities and naps. What you're really mapping is a mood other peoples claimed to recognize: Egyptians, who folded cycles and floods into ledgers; Minoans, whose harbors learned new calendars; Phoenicians, who made the West ordinary with trade winds and gossip; Carthaginian explorers, who wrote horizons into sentences; Greek poets, who kept gardens beyond sunset; Roman geographers, who measured shorelines with concrete manners; Celtic sailors, who let fog draw phantom coasts; Arab navigators, who named the Sea of Darkness and brought it home in star compasses and stories; scholars in other libraries who copied, corrected, and quietly kept the rumor alive. All of them, in their different rooms, claim to know the island, sort of, not by pin, but by personality. The paper gives off a faint starch fragrance when you lean close, and the lamp's warmth becomes a tiny sun that sets in the Aegean corner and rises politely near Cadiz. You test the quiet by saying nothing for a whole breath. Then, too, for your second soft joke, you hang an imaginary "Do Not Disturb" sign on the Atlantic that reads, "Currently lost. Please leave biscuits," and you slip an invisible biscuit onto the margin, just in case the ocean observes snacks. A mainstream anchor is helpful at bedtime. The Pillars of Heracles most often mean the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow door between Iberia and North Africa that mariners have treated as a hinge longer than anyone can nap. Knowing that feels like finding the cool side of the pillow. You touch the air above the strait the way you touch a museum label, close enough to learn, far enough to behave, and the paper forgives you for nearly trespassing by staying flat. You notice, with fondness, that the lamp's ripple on your map matches the ripple it will make on other papers in other rooms. Press sheets clapping softly, tide ledgers ruled like lullabies. Even the narrow suit line a patient instrument will draw when the ground clears its throat. You're already collecting sounds: the fans h-h, sh, the pipes clonk, the refrigerator's long vowel, the possible bell under a plaza that may or may not exist. The ocean you're after is partly an orchestra of small, competent noises that never ask for applause. Another less attested whisper tiptoes in. Wearing good sandals, a late traveler claimed a temple lamp at Sais never went out, fed by clever wicks and a priestly schedule. and that its smoke rose straight even on fussy nights. Charming, unverified, you add it to your maybe shelf because constant, gentle light is precisely the technology your eyelids crave. For your third soft joke, you imagine philosophers with Wi-Fi network name, forms and good, and you still mistyping the password 3 times before the lamp forgives you. The fan pretends not to laugh, staying in character as serf. Steady things keep arranging themselves. Plato's telling ends mid-sentence in Critias, like a drawer that stops shy of the click, open enough to let air in, closed enough to keep dust out. That unfinished edge is a kindness to every civilization that later claimed to know a piece of the island it left room for them to speak without shouting over a period. Your finger, hovering, draws a small circle in air where nothing is printed, then rubs it away with the side of your thumb, practicing the bedtime art of ghosting a dot presence. Absence, presence. Historians still argue whether traces of real disasters, quakes, tsunamis, drowned keys rolled downhill into later stories by honest gravity, or whether grand morals went shopping for scenery an audience would recognize. They argue because they are awake. You are allowed to borrow their questions without their caffeine. The map accepts your role listener, not judge, traveler, not conqueror, collector of gentle noises and agreeable textures. Outside, a very polite car passes and leaves a white arc on the window that looks like a bow wave on glass. The paper creaks when you adjust its corner, and the creak sounds like a favorable wind deciding to cooperate. You secure the rebellious edge with a smooth pebble from a patient beach and tie a tiny cord around it with a neat loop over-under through your signature knot, behaving at home the way it will behave on docks and catwalks, and, much later, on a gate that hums like a monk. You try on the idea that many peoples knew Atlantis not by coordinates, but by family resemblance, stories that liked rings and rules. Coasts that liked to revise themselves by millimeters until someone called the result a miracle. Libraries that liked to misplace and then remember. Pilots who liked to list smells, tar, resin, kelp, date cakes, iron on the tongue. Poets who liked gardens that applaud at sunset. Knowing becomes a flavor you can recognize with your eyes closed. The map, flattered, smooths under the warmth of your wrist. Your hand rests an inch above the blue one last time, not to press, only to promise, and the lamp, delighted to be a moon, pulls a final silver path across the ocean and parks it at the edge of your blanket. You follow that path without getting up, just a breath. And imagine the first doorway will walk through warm stone, olives polite as tiny moons, a reed pen resting its dark tip on a dish as if it had been writing in its sleep. You don't reintroduce anything, you simply stand and go, the way water slips out of a harbor without telling anyone it has chosen the tide. The fan keeps the shoreline sound. The refrigerator hum keeps the harbor vowel. The room holds its temperature like a careful archive. The blanket performs its excellent impression of calm water. Attendance is taken by nobody in particular and still feels complete. You leave the map warm where your wrist has been. Fold it along the friendly crease you taught with your palm, and let the drawer receive it with that favorite bedtime courtesy, no click at the end, only quiet acceptance. The air tastes faintly of paper and patience. Your breath agrees. The knight nods. The next room is waiting with olives and voices and a story that sounds like evening itself. The room has evening shoulders round, warm, relaxed, and you lean over papyrus that remembers the sun and now agrees to glow by candle. The wick breathes in tiny sips. The flame wavers once like a polite bow and then steadies, pouring a tide of light across the scroll that looks suspiciously like the lamp's ripple on your bedroom map. Olives on a dish shine like tiny moons, because olives are famously good at being helpful props. And you promise out loud, just once, not to steal one until at least one paragraph has been respectable. Your breath keeps the metronome the fan taught you, and the reed pen on the saucer rests its black tip as if it has already written the night and is just letting you catch up. A doorway murmurs, then keeps quiet. Clay cups exchange nods on a low table. Plato's voice is measured, the kind of calm that makes rooms gentle. He calls on Timaeus to start the universe tonight, and then, as if he knows your map is folded nearby, he reaches for a different scroll, the story of a power beyond the strait your fingertip hovered over. Rings of land and water arrive in his sentences like polite guests in concentric chairs. A temple gleams with orichalcum, that coin-colored word that tastes faintly of iron in your mouth, the same teaspoon you have been noticing at harbors. You keep your diploma in not touching fragile things at attention. No finger on ink, no olive heist, and the papyrus, pleased, lies flatter. A steady fact sits itself near the olives with clean hands. Plato's two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, are the canonical home of this tale, written in the 4th century BCE. He places the island beyond the pillars of Heracles, gives it a gift for engineering and law, sets it opposite a virtuous Athens, and then, in a single day and night, lets sea and earth tidy the slate. The drama is smooth, almost administrative. You picture a clerk stamping, completed on a horizon. Historians still argue whether Plato intends the island chiefly as a moral device, his Athens needing a glamorous foil, or as a dressed memory, perhaps filtered through Solon's reported visit to Sais. They also tug at his 9,000 years, wondering if Egyptian months took the long way into Greek counting. The debate behaves like a draft through the room, detectable, cooling, not impolite. You are not here to arbitrate. You are here for tone, for the soft, confident way the voice folds an island into sentences like linen into drawers. A moth circles the candle once, admires its own discretion, and chooses to live, which you appreciate. The reed pen rolls a fraction and clinks ceramic, a tiny cousin of the polite clonk you love from good pipes and dock cleats. For your first soft joke, you imagine an ancient app called Moral or Map that loads slowly, advises yes, and then suggests a hydrating beverage. 5 stars, efficient. Plato continues, and the scroll sighs like a small sail, remembering it has a job. The papyrus has texture ridges from river plants combed into pages, and your hovering fingertip feels their geography without trespass. Plato mentions canals wide enough for triremes, bridges designed for parades. He inventories metals with the satisfaction of a merchant balancing ledgers. You can smell resin from the ink and a whisper of olive wood from the pen, plus a ribbon of cinnamon that you absolutely did not bring in your pocket, but which insists on following your weeks like a friendly rumor. You let the spice live on your maybe shelf beside the drowned plaza bell and other comforting impossibilities. A less attested anecdote tiptoes in with an apologetic cough. A later copyist, the story goes, dozed off over Critias and woke to a blot. Then scribbled in the margin that he'd been sunk by the tail. Charming, unverified. You set it gently next to the dish and do not let any olive oil near it. Still, when Plato's syntax loops through another meticulous measure, you understand the soporific power of precision done late at night. He invokes Solon, the lawgiver, and the room shifts temperature a hair cooler. River evening cool as if Egypt just walked through the doorway wearing shade. You catch the direction of our next step without needing a signpost. Sais will have a stone that keeps its chill and reeds that write a static rain. For now, Athens drinks from the idea of older records, priests, cycles, long memory. A city that knows everything is a season. Plato flatters that memory and, conveniently, builds a bridge for you to cross. The olives are patient. You reach and choose exactly one, then pretend it is a coin from orichalcum, even though your tongue is too honest to be fooled. For your second soft joke, you imagine the olive complaining about being cast as a planet. I didn't train for this, and then nobly fulfilling the role anyway. The candle approves by not guttering. The moth takes a well-earned break on a quiet piece of papyrus. A second steady fact settles its elbows carefully. Critias, the dialogue with the most island in it, breaks off mid-sentence. No flourish, no curtain, just the textual equivalent of a drawer that stops shy of a click. That unfinished edge is a hospitality. It invites centuries of we might know, letting civilization step in with polite maybes, palaces with sea frescoes, harbors that loved resin, charts with tidy circles, fog bells that ring once and then mind their own business. The pause is a door left on the latch. You are good at doors like that. Plato lands on orichalcum again, and you taste the word a second time, bright, alloy, rhetorical shine. Your mouth keeps its teaspoon of iron. Your mind shelves a question without needing to answer it. For your third soft joke, you decide the Academy's Wi-Fi, if the Academy had Wi-Fi, would be named Forms and Good, and the password would be Single Day and Night, which you would mistype twice before the lamp forgave you. The room refrains from laughing, which is polite of it. He speaks of processions perfecting their circuits over bridges that learned to be beautiful. He puts bulls in courtyards and laws in calendars and virtue in measured distance. Each detail is neat, almost the way a linen press is neat, and you feel a cousin of that smoothness in the ripple of light that runs down the papyrus when you breathe. The rhythm has been constant since your fan taught it to you on your blanket. Your own pulse becomes an instrument in an orchestra that doesn't mind playing pianissimo. A less attested printing house rumor sneaks in from a distant century and sits crisscross by the candle. A Venetian printer once tucked a tiny ringed harbor inside a decorative capital O in a Plato edition as a private wink for readers with magnifiers and spare afternoons. Charming, unverified, still. The way the candle circles the letter tonight makes you think it could have happened, and that is enough for bedtime. You think of your signature knot, over, under, through, and notice how the tale ties itself, Athens to Egypt, to the Atlantic, ethics to topography, a loop you could practice with rope or sentences. The knot holds not by force, but by order. If someone tugs, it tightens without drama. That is how you prefer your myths workable, calm, helpful to hands. Plato lets the island go. He returns the floor to other voices. The papyrus edge cools your knuckle when you lean in to admire a line of careful capitals. Outside the door, a donkey gives one step of commentary, and the sound is exactly the one you collect from honest walls and wooden piers, a single clonk with nothing to prove. Attendance in miniature. Historians still argue whether Solon is a real hinge in this door or a literary coat that makes the shoulders sit right, whether the priests of Sais kept ledgers that could survive centuries of floods, whether beyond the pillars is a compass bearing or a posture toward the west. The room does not mind being a place where questions are better furniture than conclusions. You inhale the ink's river breath and put your thumb on the thought that what people recognized in this story across cultures was not a postcode, but a personality rings, rules, pride, correction, tide. The candle lifts a narrower flame, a sign it is remembering to be mortal. You touch the table lightly, not to press, only to promise, and the wood replies with borrowed warmth, the way gunwales and benches and gate rails have been doing all week. One olive remains. You leave it for the philosopher, which is either generous or superstitious, and is harmless either way. When you stand, the papyrus makes the faintest whisper, the kind of sound a tide ledger's pencil would make in a quiet hut by a quay. The moth approves your posture and decides you're a trustworthy tree. You step toward the night and feel the corridor cool by a degree your cheekbones can measure. Ahead, the air smells of water tamed into courtyards. Your breath keeps the itch. You promised it. Your hands keep their diploma. Your pocket keeps, impossibly, that intrepid thread of cinnamon. Stone is waiting in shadow-carved ripples you will read with air, a ruler of light laid across a floor like a Nilometer cousin. A cat supervising from an inscription with the dignity of a small moon. The voice you have been listening to just built you a bridge. You cross without telling anyone you've decided to. The door opens onto shade that tastes like river dusk. Your map folds itself at home and agrees to meet you in a different alphabet. Stone takes your heat and gives you its cool in exchange, as fair as any market, and the courtyard of Sais receives you with the politeness of shade that has practiced for centuries. Papyrus fronds comb the light into thin ribbons. Their static rain shh, shh, sounds like parchment agreeing with ink. The air tastes of incense and river dusk resin, damp clay, the faintest breath of something sweet that might be date cake or might be your traveling ribbon of cinnamon sneaking into another century without credentials. You let the smell be a rumor and keep your hands in the posture, your diploma in not touching. Fragile things approves hovering, attentive, reverent. A wall of carved ripples runs along the colonnade, water taught to hold still in a stone. Your fingertip moves a hair width above them and feels the geometry by air alone. The grooves stay cool. Please, you remembered your manners. A boy carries a tray of cups with a steady gravity of a librarian moving atlases. Somewhere beyond, a pool keeps a small mirror for the sky. Dragonflies write cursive on it and erase themselves instantly, which is clearly the preferred editorial policy in this temple. Your steady fact takes a seat beside the basin with dignified sandals. Sais is a delta city devoted to Neith. Greek visitors associated her, sometimes, with Athena. Greek writers, Plato among them, place Solon here in the 6th century BCE, hearing from priests who kept old records about cycles of flood and fire. The connection between Athens and this courtyard is not a tidy passport stamp, but the path is well worn by Solon's era. Greeks lived and traded at Naucratis downriver, a licensed enclave of Hellenic shops and shrines. Messages travel where bread and ship rope do. Stories learn the schedules of ferries. The stone under your palm remembers river temperatures and decides you can share. A priest in linen the color of almond flesh leads you past a column where faint paint refuses to brag. He gestures toward a measuring rod inked with black lines, the cousin of a nilometer, its marks marching down wood like disciplined eyebrows. The rod is a tied staff for a river, a way to count without panic. You love it immediately, the way you love the single harbor bell and the calm drawer that is stopped shy of a click. Historians still argue whether Solon truly sat in a hall like this to hear a tale that later wore Plato's voice, or whether Sais is a literary stage chosen to dress a moral in Egyptian longevity. They also argue whether the 9,000 years belongs to Egyptian months mistranslated into Greek pride. Another point they nudge whether Neith as Athena is a respectful identification or a convenient bridge across pantheons. The argument drifts around the court like a breeze that can't decide which front deserves attention. The priest, used to both kinds of wind, pours water from a jar into a shallow bowl and lets silence take a sip. A cat appears from nowhere, the correct number of feline witnesses in any sacred precinct, and chooses a threshold to supervise. For your first soft joke, you imagine the temple Wi-Fi, if it existed, would be Neith Nits, and the password would require a weaving mnemonic that you would mistype 3 times before the cat permitted access. The cat blinks once, which you take as a conditional approval. The priest declines to comment. The corridor smells like cool plaster and clean shadow. Your sandals make a whisper, the floor edits into good prose. The scribe's room is narrower, more private. Shelves keep rolled pages under wooden labels, tidy as a tied ledger. A beam of light through a slit draws a ruler across the floor you could measure your calm against. The scribe seats you before a tablet, incised with firm, shallow cuts, and reads voice low, agreeable to sleep about cycles that rearrange cities when the stars and water rehearse their old choreography. It isn't the island by name, it's the mood you've been tracking since your blanket's ripple first impersonated moonlight. A less attested rumor slides into the corner and sits cross-legged travelers later claimed the temple here tended an ever-burning lamp. If flame the drafts could not persuade, charming, unverified, you say to yourself, and place it on the same shelf as the drowned bell and the printer's secret ringed harbor. Still, the way this light behaves, disciplined, generous, makes the rumor feel like a metaphor dressed for work. The scribe shows you a shelf list, a thin wooden slip dotted with neat strokes, and your heart commits a small, respectable swoon for inventory done kindly. For your second soft joke, you picture a sign at the door, please do not pet the hieroglyphs, and you obey so completely that your hands try to applaud without touching each other. The scribe smiles with one eyelid, the highest form of delta humor. Outside, reed leaf static resumes. The pool mirrors a square of sky like a stamp on a receipt. A novice carries a basket of offerings past a relief where boats glide along a stone river, oars in elegant agreement. You watch 3 carved birds practice the same flight the fresco swallows will paint for you later, and you promise them silently you will not pet them either. Your hands are getting very good at promising. Historians still argue whether Egyptians kept written disaster records old enough to satisfy Greek longing for antiquity, and if so, whether those records referred to regional floods and fires that became global in translation. They also debate whether the priests of Sais would have been inclined to flatter a visiting lawgiver by making Athens older via Neath Athena parallels. You let the questions arrange themselves like cups on a tray orderly, not urgent, and taste the thin barley drink offered, which might be the exact temperature of sensible conversation. The cat patrols past, tail erect, and relocates to the top of a staircase that goes nowhere, which is a very cat solution. A plaque beside the rod records last season's rise, generous, not catastrophic, the kind of flood that makes grain philosophical. For your third soft joke, you imagine a temple notice board festival schedule subject to Nilometer. Please refresh for updates and watch as a junior priest actually checks the rod again, because practical jokes here are indistinguishable from work. Your thumb hovers over a carved ripple and feels the cool as if stone could conduct temperature through air. The sensation recalls the whisper of your lamp over papyrus, the way the press's ink warmed sheets that clapped faintly as they dried, the way your jar of not tea clarified itself because gravity is a librarian. You're collecting humble miracles, millimeters, meters, the long, courteous breath of a river made legible. Another less attested tidbit arrives with the smell of wax. Some families near the delta told their children that on a still night you can hear a lamp hum just one note from deep inside the precinct when the flood peaks and begins to fall. Charming, unverified, and yet the reed leaves do rub one longer syllable into the air, a sound your ribs file under monk vowel with the gate's low hum still to come. The scribe sets down the tablet and smooths it with his palm, the same motion you used on your map in lamplight, and a cousin of the same motion a diver will use underwater to coax silt to settle. He points to a small column of signs, numbers, like a staircase, and taps a date. Rain year, he says, as if to remind the future that Egyptian time is kept by people and floods, not only by constellations. The equivalence is messy. The story is tidy. The courtyard approves both. Historians still argue whether that 9,000 is the hero of this arithmetic misunderstanding or a deliberate grandeur designed to float a moral like a lantern down a river. They also argue whether our hunger for this connection, Athens, Sais, Neath, Athena, months, years, says more about us than about them. The cat, asked for an opinion, chooses to yawn, which is defensible scholarship. A breeze comes through the court, practiced and unobtrusive. The papyrus blades comb it into manageable threads. You follow your guide around to a doorway where a lintel keeps a shadow cool enough to drink. A basin waits for a hand you're allowed to dip. and you do the water is river sweet, clay cool, and agreeably undecided about destination. It reminds you of mid-sentence pauses, critias, drifting off, drawers stopping shy of clicks. How stories that remain slightly open are the easiest to live with. The priest gestures toward a small stela leaned in the corner, signs brushed with ochre, edges smoothed by either touch or time. You do not ask of it what it cannot give. You let it be exactly as informative as a label that says provenance known, provenience debated, and your shoulders drop another measured notch on your private tithe staff. Somewhere beyond the wall, a donkey offers a single perfect hoofbeat clonk, and your collection of polite percussions is once again complete. When you leave, the cat pretends not to notice you and therefore notices you most completely. The corridor trades cool for sun by increments your cheekbones can count. You carry with you the temperature of a stone and the smell of river dusk, a number written in a proud column, and a handful of maybes you will keep labeling as such. The path back to the lane is powdered with dust that doesn't mind your sandals. The gate's shadow lies where gates prefer to lie, long and neat. You step through, and the world brightens by one respectable degree. The road smells of crushed leaf and baked brick, and out beyond the date palms, the breath of the wider sea begins threading through the river's sentence. Your fan at home rehearsed this tempo for you. The harbor belle you love would approve this pacing. You will follow the river down to where Greek shops at Naucratis gossip in two alphabets, and where pilots lift their noses to distinguish resin from kelp. The island is not a pin. It is a flavor other peoples recognize and describe with their own utensils. You walk toward it without urgency, stone cool still living along your palm like a promise kept. You follow the river down until the breath of the larger water slides under your collar, and then you're on a quay where jars smell of olive and sun, ropes exhale salt, and gulls edit the morning with white commas. A small boat takes your weight politely, boards spring and remember you. Your hands tie the painter in the knot your fingers now make without thinking over, under, through, and your signature knot sits there like a little seal of approval. The helmsman nods. A bell gives one exact syllable attendance, and the prow leans toward a long blue idea the pilots call a road. Your fan at home would recognize the tempo. The sea keeps it, too. Days later, asleep, or 3 later, the air shifts from river sweet to island time, and plaster under your palm holds last evening's warmth the way a loaf remembers the oven. You step into a court that likes breezes, light poured down a stair like milk, and a wall where dolphins move through blue without tiring. Their bellies flash ivory, their eyes, painted small and knowing, make you behave. You practice your diploma in not touching fragile things by petting the air an inch from the plaster. The dolphins accept the gesture as legal tender and continue to swim in place, which is an advanced island skill. Your steady fact sets down a basket of figs and speaks with the self-possession of white stone on Crete in the 2nd millennium. BCE flourishes a civilization we call Minoan palatial centers at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, storerooms ribbed with pithoi, stairwells that fall in love with light, frescoes of lilies, swallows, and the sea, plumbing that takes rainwater seriously. writing on clay linear A that still refuses to tell us its secrets. Their harbors amnisos. Como smell like resin and wet rope. Their ships carry jars and ideas to Egypt and the Levant and home again. Sea roads threat everything. You walk those quiet steps, worn to a soft velvet by centuries of sandals, and the plaster at your fingertips keeps a moderate temperature, as if it has tenure in comfort. Up a corridor, a light well drops a square of a sky down into an interior that could teach courtyards elsewhere how to breathe. In a storeroom, row after row of pithoi keep their mouths stoppered like modest guests. For your first soft joke, you imagine a Minoan label maker, a little clay stamp reading, "Please return amphora clean." And you picture a very earnest steward nodding at this sensible policy. A breeze streams through the dolphin room, curls, and exits like a well-trained cat. The paint stays cool, the blue deep as evening. A guide points toward a doorway that opens upon a balcony and the taste of salt. Down in the harbor, a worker adjusts a coil with exactly your knot family resemblance across centuries, and a child sends a reed boat into a runnel that thinks very highly of its current. Your shoulders lower a notch. The island knows how to teach mussels manners. Historians still argue whether the great eruption of Santorini Thera in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, its ash burying the town at Akrotiri in an exquisite freeze frame, directly eroded Minoan power, or whether earthquakes, trade shifts, and Mycenaean neighbors did more of the work. They also argue about the exact year the mountain let go and how cleanly that date aligns with trouble in palaces. The debate walks the colonnade with you, not noisy, just present, like sandals that crunch a little pumice and then apologize. A less attested anecdote folds itself into the shade. Some say that, at a precise time of morning, a shaft of sun slides down a light well, and the dolphin eyes take on a glimmer so convincing that a cat, temple-trained or otherwise, once leaped at the wall and thumped back to earth with dignity. Charming, unverified, you set it on your maybe shelf beside drowned bells and ever-burning lamps, and you promise the dolphins you believe in their talents regardless. You step out where stairs tumble toward a view of hills wearing olives like constellations. The air smells of thyme, clean linen, and sea. A stone bench returns your weight exactly and then forgets you, which is how benches do their best work. In a distant storeroom, a jar lit Sais. Small ceramics do have opinions, and you remember the gentle clonk of pipes and cleats you've been collecting. A percussion section that refuses drama. Another steady fact chooses the language of harbors. Minoan trade stretches in steady arcs. Cretan goods turn up in Egypt. Egyptian things rest in Cretan rooms. Seals carry motifs that travel like signatures. At Akrotiri, on Santorini, streets and houses preserved by ash keep wall pictures of ships riding swells past cities with zigzag walls. In those same rooms, bowls and beds wait as if their owners stepped out to check the wind. The town's silence tastes like cooled bread, which is to say hospitable. You duck into a corridor where cool air snakes along the floor, and for your second soft joke, you imagine a Bronze Age open-plan brochure features cross-draft, dolphin art, 0 closets, heroic stair count, and you reassure the imaginary realtor that yes, you'll take the breeze. A swallow fresco blinks from another wall, quick, angular, thrilled with flight, and you absolutely do not pet it. Your hands hover in the pose your diploma likes best. Your breath takes the It has practiced since the map rippled your blanket at home. Historians still argue whether the myth of a labyrinth belongs here as more than metaphor, palace as maze, king as collector of hallways, bull leaping as headline, or whether the story chased interesting architecture the way a cat chases sun rectangles. They also argue whether linear A hides inventory lists, hymns, or something cheekier under its tidy wedges. The air is fine letting these questions pad along beside you like dogs who know the route. A long gallery opens on a view of Aegean light, and beyond, blue mountains keep their cool with the discipline of a folded cloak. Below, at Amnisos, the sea makes itself useful and occasionally smug. You close your eyes and hear every small sound you've trained to recognize oarlocks thocking, a rope tail applauding a cleat, a bell down the quay offering one good note and retiring. You do not need coordinates. You are learning a civilization by its soundtrack. A less attested harbor rumor knocks once elders along certain Cretan coasts told children they could hear. On windless nights, a deep purr from a drowned jetty further along the bay stone, talking under fish, the old road underwater. Charming, unverified. You add it gently to your shelf, which is now the size of a decent pantry and smells like thyme, linen, and maybe the faintest uninvited cinnamon thread you cannot account for. The light shifts by a polite degree. A guide leads you toward storerooms where huge jars rise like short, careful giants. Their shoulders are rope-scratched and salt-patient. A wooden ladder rests against a wall and remembers 1,000 forearms. You feel in your own the echo of lifting, lowering, counting, notating a choreography you've met in Sais with a shelf list, in a monastery with a tide slate, and in a press where proofs learn to clap. Logistics is a lullaby when done kindly. Historians still argue whether some Minoan harbors had elaborate breakwaters, now half asleep beneath silt, and whether those lines are human steadfastness or geology flattering itself with straight edges. They also wonder how far Minoan ships ranged on ordinary business versus festival bravado. You let the questions sit while the basil outside rubs scent on the air with every small wind. For your third soft joke, you propose a Bronze Age frequent sailor program, earn amphora points, redeem for top-tier rope, and the harbor approves by letting a boat nose a fender with the exact soft clonk you love. A child cheers once, attendance for the dock, and then goes back to redistributing pebbles in a pattern only tides will fully appreciate. A stair takes you down to a threshold worn to satin. Beyond it, a patch of floor is paved with smooth river stones, sensible and good for the feet. In a nearby room, a low bench near a pillar invites a nap that would scandalize a tour but please a human. You sit without sitting, hover without touching, and let your breath enroll the space in your favorite meter. The dolphins go on with their work, which is to pretend to be in motion while being very old. Another steady fact, quiet and practical, the Minoans kept magazines of oil and grain that speak in volume and order. They built with ashlar, with gypsum that catches light. They placed horns of consecration along roof lines like a crowd of listening silhouettes. On Santorini, at Akrotiri, A city sleeps under ash in the act of tidying rooms cleared. Doors shut, its clocks stopped by a mountain. The silence of Akrotiri and the motion of Cretan walls rhyme in a way the ear likes more than the tongue can explain. Historians still argue whether the very neat story, the one that says a single catastrophe explains every change, should ever be allowed near a civilization this busy, and whether later neighbors took advantage of a shock or simply arrived with sharper elbows. They also argue if the sea roads that fed Crete became, for a while, the very paths of its undoing. The dolphins declined the invitation to comment, which is within their rights. When you step back into the sun, a breeze braids your hair with a grain of salt. The horizon performs its old magic trick line, maybe an island, maybe a cloud, then becomes a line again. A steward passes carrying a tray of cups, barley drink or water, the temperature of common sense. You accept. You taste clay and shade and the faint educational hint of time. The harbor below blinks with light on wave faces. Someone tightens a line with the knot, you know. The line hums a little note monk vowel in miniature, and your ribs agree at once. In a corner of the courtyard, a swallow writes a quick parabola and edits it out with a wingtip. You admire how many people have practiced not touching this bird. You leave by a stair that feels exactly right in the foot, a dimension good builders have known since stones were persuasion. The plaster near the door keeps its moral temperature. You pass your hand an inch away, and it thanks you by staying unmarred. Down the lane, time leans and pretends to ignore you. At the quay, the bell is considering one syllable. It offers it because it too has learned restraint. The boat rocks in that polite way boats use when they are pleased with the weather. You step on, the rope releases the cleat with a purr. The helmsman chooses a road on the water that someone has chosen 1,000 times. The dolphins on the wall remain behind, swimming forever in perfect blue. Not a map, not a moral, only a talent for making you breathe in a way that makes sense. Ahead, the swell darkens toward a coast scented with resin, and long practice another harbor that knows where the west begins and how to steer by smell. You let the island behind you be exactly as old as it needs to be, and the sea before you be exactly as patient. The bell does not ring again. Once was perfect. The harbor smells like resin, wet rope, and a pan of sardines someone forgot to stop perfecting. Timbers creak with that agreeable old house sound, and bronze scales clink in a stall where a merchant measures out purple-dyed wool with the ceremony of a priest. A bell on a post gives a single, punctual syllable attendance and retires with dignity. Your chest answers in the tempo it learned from your fan and from dolphin rooms and stone courts alike. And the air writes a fine salt gloss along your cheeks that makes everything feel finished on purpose. Your hands find work quickly, your signature knot takes a coil on a bit and sits there smug as a sleeping cat who has memorized maritime law. Gulls hover like punctuation marks over a key scribbled with amphora names, wine, oil, fish sauce, and little Phoenician letters that look as tidy as your favorite shelf list at Sais. A pilot with resin in his beard and moonlight in his eyes points west, beyond the creaking mouth of the strait you traced with a hovering fingertip on your map. "Gay there first," he says, nodding to the island city close by, then perhaps farther. The word perhaps behaves like a small sail, catching enough wind to be interesting and not enough to cause trouble. You're a steady fact steps aboard with bare feet and balance by the first millennium BCE. Phoenician sailors from Tyre and Sidon established colonies along these coasts. Gadir Cadiz, among the oldest in the West, trading metals, saltfish, glass, and the famous dye teased from murex shells. Greek writers knew a wealthy region inland as Tartessos, a kingdom or confederation along the lower Guadalquivir, rich in silver and well worth anyone's polite curiosity. The clink you hear is commerce, the smell is logistics. The alphabet on the crates is a souvenir that will eventually teach half the world how to write payables. The keyboards flex like careful knees as you step into a lane of booths, where bronze weights sit in pairs like patient pets. A boy sprinkles seawater on wicker baskets of figs to make them shine. A woman threads cord through a new net and hums a rhythm the oarlocks you love would recognize. For your first soft joke, you imagine a loyalty program stamped into little clay tokens, 10 amphora tops, one free lecture on safe coiling, and the knot at your wrist pretends not to be flattered. Historians still argue whether Tartessos was a single urban center near the river's mouth, a moving name for a whole estuary world of markets and mines, or, in harder years, a memory Greeks kept because it kept their maps cheerful. They also argue whether Carthaginian control later drew a curtain across these routes, letting Greek ships through when useful and not when otherwise. The strait itself offers no statement. It creaks its timber music and continues to be a door that sometimes opens and sometimes insists you knock in a particular accent. A less attested harbor story sets its elbows on a barrel and leans in. An ancient writer tells of a Phoenician captain who, spotting a rival on his secret tin route, steered his own ship onto a shoal to prevent discovery. The estate repaid his losses like a sensible insurance plan, and the rumor grew legs longer than any oar. Charming, only partly trusted, you file it beside drowned bells and ever-burning lamps and your favorite printer's ornamental O. Still, when a pilot's eyes flick left at a wake and then go neutral, you recognize the move of someone who has a bend in mind and a habit of letting questions behave themselves. You pause by a tangle of anchors, some a stone, some lead, and run your fingertips through air just above the cool shapes, the way you traced carved ripples in Sais. Your diploma in not touching remains handsomely framed in invisible gold. A fishmonger's knife makes a whisper you file next to quills and reed pens. A clay stamp thuds into a jar collar with the same modest clunk you've learned to trust in pipes and barge fenders. Everything here is percussion for people who like small noises that do honest work. On the seaside of the island, the pilot shows you a spit of land. The tide edits every few hours like a meticulous proofreader. We cross at slack, he says, and you admire the poetry of a plan that relies on teaching time to meet you halfway. For your second soft joke, you draft a mental memo titled Atlantic Etiquette Bullet Points include say please to currents, compliment headlands, and always hydrate, and the pilot, without hearing you, nods as if you have contributed something to the literature. We walk past a shrine where a bronze hand holds a tiny boat. Smoke from an oil lamp smells like clean metal and palm. The flame reminds you of that rumored lamp in Sais, the one drafts couldn't persuade, and you grant this one honorary membership in the Society of Useful Metaphors. Beyond, a tannery whispers vinegar and hides. Beyond that, a smith's yard breathes warm iron. You taste like the familiar teaspoon you've been collecting from every trustworthy harbor. The air in your mouth is older than the alphabet and twice as cooperative. Historians still argue whether Greek poets who praised Tartessos tasted the river themselves or quoted pilots in a pleasant chain of custody, and whether beyond the pillars always meant exactly this strait to every ear or drifted like a cloud to other narrows when a storyteller needed range. They also contend gently about the silver route, how straight it was, how secret, how far north it lifted for tin, because metals make maps behave. The arguments take place at a volume appropriate for biscuit eating. Nobody knocks over a cup. A market scribe sits with a wax tablet and a stylus, touching prices into the soft surface with the same concentration a monk uses on vellum. He thinks in tidy reversible marks. He leaves room at the edge for corrections. You love him immediately because margins are a species of mercy. For your third soft joke, you imagine the scribe's tablet complaining at sunset, "I did not consent to hold fish math," and the scribe soothing it with a clean scrape, and a promise of better nouns tomorrow. The pilot returns from the harbor master's hut with a reed of permission and points at the mouth where the strait begins to practice being itself. "We leave on the breath after the bell," he says. As if hired, the bell gives one neat note and declines to be dramatic again. Your breath answers, "Arsh," and the boat shoulders water like a friendly door. The masts ahead make a small forest you already know how to read by sound guides thock. Lines purr, blocks exclaim once and then behave. Out beyond the breakwater, wind trims itself suitably, and you taste resin from the freshly caulked seam near your ankle. The pilot's thumb rests on the tiller with the same unshowy authority you saw on the river, and in the dolphin room, a person who expects edges to cooperate if asked in the correct tone. You approve of the method. You have been traveling by please and thank you all week. The helmsman points into the west, where the sky lowers a shade like a storekeeper pulling an awning. "If you were going to disappear," he says amicably, "you would choose a day of reasonable swells and quiet gossip. You agree. A place can remain almost found for a very long time if every merchant along the way would rather sell rope than arguments." The oarlocks on a neighboring boat provide their old lullaby thock. Thock and your shoulders remember how to descend one measured notch, the way good flood marks a step down a key. A less attested sea trick shows itself. For a minute, a heat haze lays a flat bar along the horizon, the kind of mirage that can lift low islands into ships and ships into cities. Someone mutters Fata Morgana with respectful superstition. The pilot shrugs. Charming, often seen, and a fine way to write maybes into margins without lying to anyone. The bar fades when wind thinks of a different joke. Near sundown, we tack back in. Gator's stones hold warmth the way Cretan plaster did, only saltier. In a counting house, a string of weights knocks each other like cousins at a wedding. In an alley, A child recites letters Aleph, Beth, Gimel while drawing them with a stick in dust. The first time anyone has ever written a bill of lading on a road, a cat supervises from atop a bale that smells like distant cedar and currant pine and a rumor of cinnamon so faint you decide not to accuse anyone of smuggling pastries. The pilot sets a palm on a small altar by the key not to push, only to promise, and you do the same. The stone returns a thin warmth and then forgets you. The exact courtesy of benches, gate rails, and press frames in other lives. Behind you, the bell considers whether to mark the shift and decides you heard it the first time. A woman in a doorway tosses you a date. Your hands catch it with an accuracy that surprises no one. Historians still argue whether the Greeks' fondness for ringed city plans wandered west, propped up by real sea towns like this, or floated back from stories to color how harbors were described. They also wonder whether certain words, parade, canal, law, were Greek ears translating foreign order into familiar music. You are content to let languages polish each other in markets as waits kiss and jars breathe. Then and now, the consensus is that business makes very polite cosmopolitans out of everyone. The day leans into evening with the elegance of a ship rounding a headland. You put a hand to the post where your knot lies like a seal, and the rope hums the monk vowel small enough to keep to yourself. Gulls write parentheses in the sky around the lighthouse and settle them with their own punctuation marks. You think ahead to a darker coast where oar handles will thock under a different set of stars, and a sailor will call the far fire volcano with the same nonchalance other people use for lantern. For now, the harbor breathes with your chest. And the strait creaks its hinge in a language you recognize from your bedroom lamp and your favorite pipe and your newest tied staff. The island is not here. It does not need to be. What you have instead is a city that knows the West, a market that measures with bronze courtesy, and a pilot whose thumb translates rumor into roots. The bell rings once only perfect manners, and the sky takes over the counting, which is exactly the sort of administrative handoff you can sleep to. Wind combs the dry foothills like a careful barber and leaves little ridges in the dust, and you taste orange blossom right in that dust as if the grove beside the river has decided to perfume the entire afternoon. The blue wall of the mountain keeps its secret cool. Even in sun, it looks like shade stacked into cliffs. A string of donkeys cinched with plaited rope gives the small percussion you've been collecting clunk, clunk, as wooden bells knock softly under their chins. Your chest keeps the fan's old meter, and the road rises into the Atlas as politely as a stair someone built for giants and then forgot to move. You reach an oasis where water remembers how to be sweet. Palms write tall shadows on tamped earth. A brazier ticks as acacia coals rearrange their red logic. In a low-walled courtyard, cups of mint leave a cold thread in the mouth even when the tea is hot. The saucers clink in that modest tone you trust from harbor cleats and temple lamps. A boy pours with a flourish that makes a long ribbon of tea find the cup without aim. He grins because gravity works better when watched. You practice your diploma in not touching fragile things by not touching the sugar cone, though it gleams like a small mountain auditioning for a myth. Your steady fact lays its map on the mat. With sand-weighted corners, the Atlas Mountains unfurl across northwest Africa from the Atlantic to Tunisia, a lifted spine that makes weather choose sides in its lee and along its shoulders. Berber-speaking peoples have long kept oases, drove flocks, and steered caravans between coast and desert. Greek and Roman writers put a name here, Atlas for the heights, and a myth for a neighbor. And some of those writers also mention a people near these slopes called Atlantes or Atarantes, a name tidy enough to be tempting. You sip, and the mint thinks politely of rivers at Sais, where numbers marched down a rod and behaved. The caravan master's scarf smells of leather and sun. His hands smell of rope and orange twig. He taps the mountain with his chin. There, he says, stone with good manners. You nod because the cliff faces a stand like pages laid open, strata reading themselves line by line. For your first soft joke, you imagine the Oasis Wi-Fi, if such a kindness existed, would be named No Bars, and you would still mistype the password twice before the palm trees forgave you. The caravan cat, who is both employer and employee, blinks from a saddle as if approving your priorities. A path threads between limestone brows and slides into shade that feels like cool water poured over the wrists. A shepherd's double reed carries up from a fold in the hills, 2 notes near each other like cousins, and the air learns its tune. On the slope, terraces hold tight to earth with dry stone walls that look like tidy speech. Fig leaves keep their own breeze while the wind above them combs the larger picture. Your signature knot keeps a rolled rug on a mule from behaving like a philosophy text in a crosswind. Historians still argue whether the Atlantes in Herodotus's book are a real ethnonym, may be garbled, a literary flourish attached to Atlas for a Greek audience, or traveler's rumor packed into proper nouns. They also argue whether later writers, like Diodorus, mean a people here at all when they sketch Atlanteans with gardens and statues, and a goddess who once loved the land more intimately than the sky. The dispute moves with you like shade cool. Welcome, not bossy. You let it make the road easier. A less attested detail from those old pages ambles over the stones with dusty dignity. One account says, "This tribe eats no living thing and curses the sun at noon because it burns." Another says they have no personal names, living instead under the cover of a single shared title like a big cloak, charming, unverified, and perhaps the product of a listener eager for marvels. You file it beside your drowned bell and your ever-burning lamp and your printer's secret ringed harbor. Still, at noon, the light does present an argument you can feel in your scalp, and your shoulders tighten in agreement before remembering their tight-staff training and drifting down a notch. You pass a low shrine of whitewashed stones where a hand-sized bell waits under a plank. The caravan master touches the wood not to push, only to promise, and the bell declines to ring, exercising the same restraint as its cousins in ports and bookshops. For your second soft joke, you picture an Atlas gym open air, goats as trainers, membership perk the mountain spots. You then decide no joke can improve on the real view, so you put it back in your pocket and simply breathe. Down in a fold, the earth runs with a hidden thread of water, and someone has coaxed it into a katara, an underground channel stepping down in shafts. desert cousin to Canats elsewhere, cooling the path of a garden into cucumbers and mint. Another steady fact taps your shoulder with a wet finger across North Africa's dry lands. Ancient engineers tucked water into tunnels to keep it from arguing with heat. Here in the Atlas forelands and farther east among the Garamantes, such work drew green onto maps where carts otherwise drew dust. Your jar of not tea approves from your bag, content that all serious clarification is subterranean. The path opens at Lixus down on the coast when you descend a stone theater. Phoenician bones of a city. Later Roman brick its hill, smelling of fennel, salt, and stories. A label in your own mind reads provenance long. Provenience this bluff. Mainstream anchors are pleasant at bedtime. Lixus was a Phoenician and then Carthaginian settlement near the Lucos River, later Roman. Myths like to keep the Garden of the Hesperides here, with Atlas nearby holding up either a sky or metaphor. You like that myths set their tables where trade already laid out dishes. Historians still argue whether tying Lixus to the Hesperides is anything more than a classical game of pin the labors on the map, and whether Atlas the mountain lent his name to Atlas the person, or the other way round, or whether a Berber root held the sound first, and Greek ears made him a fellow with shoulders. They also argue whether the Atlantis of texts refer to a people at Lixus's latitude or to a broader horizon of mountain folk whose names were courteously mispronounced. You pat the air above a carved block the way you once petted fresco swallows and stone ripples, and congratulate yourself on not rearranging antiquity with your fingers. In the market below, a woman sells oranges from a mat. You buy one, and the peel sprays a bright oil that smells like the exact promise in tonight's outline. The sweetness under the dust is so cooperative, you forgive the sun its earlier sternness. For your third soft joke, you propose a new SPF called Solon 9000, which protects you for precisely the number of years a debate can last. The caravan cat refuses to laugh, but does sit in your shade, which is endorsement enough. Evening finds you again at the foothill oasis, where the water's mirror holds a slice of indigo sky. Drums whisper somewhere out near the tamarisks. A flute answers from an adobe porch. You practice listening the way you practiced not touching, from one breath to the next. Letting sounds arrive uninsisted. A goat bell small, brass. Deer gives one syllable and then retires. Attendance again by modest committee. You turn the orange in your palm and think of other rings canals in a philosopher's sentences. Dolphin lanes painted around a room. Light wells that placed the sky into stairwells. Charts that kept circles for maybe islands. Rings and rules are how so many peoples knew the big island, sort of by temperament, a society that loves order, a coast that likes formal gardens, a city that keeps decent canals and then vanishes like a meeting adjourned on time. The Atlas people in the books, whoever they were, become cousins in that family resemblance, gardeners at the edge, names tied to a mountain that behaves like a border drawn by geology's tidy thumb. A breeze brings the faint taste of iron from a smithy. You cannot see a spoonful of harbor in a mountain town, and a ribbon of cinnamon that has no business being here and yet keeps arriving in your weeks, like a rumor with good timing. You keep it on the maybe shelf, which now smells frankly wonderful. Historians still argue whether the classical accounts of people who cursed the sun were rhetorical devices meant to make readers feel safely centered. Look, those are the strange ones, or if a ceremony around noon existed and was misunderstood by listeners who didn't stay long. They also argue whether our modern hunger to find Atlanteans under Atlas is an echo chamber built by the coincidence of syllables. You are not in the business of verdicts. You are in the business of tying a coil to a peg so that a sleep can moor without fuss. The night arrives by increments your cheekbones can count. The mountain wall, blue all day, goes almost black and then kind again as the stars shake out their linen. A tea glass rings its thin note. A donkey decides to rearrange its opinions. A child recites numbers as if they were birds returning to a roost. You remember the shelf list at Sais, the tide staff on the quay, the market scribe in Gadir soothing his wax with a scrape. Every place keeps lists when it wants to be kind. You lay 2 fingers lightly on the rim of a water jar, not to push, only to promise, and the clay returns a memory of cool before forgetting you delightfully. The bell does not ring again. Once is perfect. The caravan cat circles twice and installs itself beside your bundle with the seriousness of a guard. You tie 1 small loop for luck, the knot lying like a sleeping question mark. You will follow the coast farther soon to a page in a pilot's book where a Carthaginian named Hanno watches fire walk into the sea and calls it west. For now, you let the oranges perfume, the mountains blue, the cups mint, and the 1 polite syllable of a goat bell become the whole map. The island other peoples claim to know sits politely in the middle distance, content to be recognized by temperament rather than address. You breathe the lesson in HH, and the oasis exhales the same answer back. Dusk lays a bruise-colored sheen across the water, and you ride it the way a palm rides cool air, hips and knees learning the small grammar of a long swell. Pitch from the seams smells like pine warmed in a pocket. Beyond the bow, the shore breathes a faint brimstone eggs and a stone after rain, the sort of warning scent the sea delivers with good manners. Oars thock in their locks, old lullaby you could hum in your sleep, and each thock stacks neatly with your chest's metronome. Night birds cross the mast like careful punctuation. 2 dashes, a comma, a respectable ellipsis. You keep your hands away from the amphorae. Your diploma in not touching fragile things salutes from its invisible frame and tug the painter's tail, so your signature knot sits flatter on the forward cleat. The line purrs a little monk vowel and behaves. A pilot points with his chin at the west, where the sky is practicing indigo. CERN, someone says, of a staging island and burning lands of a coast beyond. The words sit down in the boat and travel with you like extra crew. Your steady fact settles into the astern. With plausibly dry sandals, a Carthaginian mariner we call Hanno led a voyage along the Atlantic coast of Africa, early 5th century BCE, by most tellings establishing outposts and recording sites in a periplus. A sailor's itinerary? The account we have survives in Greek translation. Tidy, compressed, practical. You picture the little proofreader in the press room penciling morale, not topographic in the margin, and then deciding, for once, that tonight can handle a little topography after all. The first island the oars find wears pumice like shoulder pads. You scoop a piece from the slick cool, weightless, surprised to be cargo and resist the urge to keep it as a bath toy for your jar of not tea. The helmsman laughs under his breath and says, "Do not let the sea know you're sentimental." For your first soft joke, you imagine a vintage Carthaginian safety card in case of floating stones. Remain calm, they are light, but feelings are lighter, and the oars agree by thocking in a slightly smug tempo. Historians still argue whether the features in Hanno's list match islands we know by later names, the Canaries, Madeira, Cape Verde, or whether his chariot of the gods was a mainland volcano such as Mount Cameroon, hurling flame into sky. They also argue whether his cairn sat near today's Arguin Bank or farther south, and how far along the bulge of Africa the fleet actually slid before prudence and provisioning turned it home. Debate, friendly as always, rides the swell with you and keeps its voice at biscuit volume. Shore returns as a low line of dark, then leans up into cliffs that smell like a forge rinsed by tide. At the foot of one wall, a black mouth inhales the sea and exhales it again in breaths as steady as your fan at home. Only deeper, older, phosphorescence flicks along the wake. The water writes light in small cursive under the oars the way your lamp wrote light across a papyrus in Athens. You find yourself petting the air an inch above the glow, as if the sea were a fresco swallow trained to accept compliments and not fingers. A less attested sailor's rumor sidles aboard, unshares your water skin without asking along certain lava shores. They say, caverns under the tide strike their own bells one low tone, when swell and hollow agree, so that at night you can steer by music as by stars. Charming, unverified. You place it beside drowned plaza vespers and ever-burning lamps and your printer's secret harbor inside an O. Still, when your ribs feel a long syllable roll through the hull, you nod to no one in particular and mark attendance with your chin. Farther on, mangroves and a river mouth turn the evening green and animal. The Periplus speaks of crocodiles and beasts that bellow in the marsh. You hear only slow machinery in the reeds click, gulp, a dignified flop. Someone points to a bank where eyes lift from black water like buttons. You keep your hands firmly in your lap and admire how the boat's shadow edits itself out of local affairs. Historians still argue whether Hanno's final note about gorillae, hairy, fierce, difficult to capture, recorded women of a coastal people, baboons pilfered from inland, or later Greek ears trying to domesticate a foreign word. They also argue whether the Periplus is one voyage or several stitched, whether later scribes shaved or padded the route, whether Carthage would have let a pilot publish coordinates without a little tasteful misdirection. The oars, loyal to sleep, keep their thock. The shore, loyal to night, keeps its silhouette. Fire arrives as a hill that throws stars sideways. At first, it is only a stain in the sky, then a throat of orange, then the definite voice of a mountain that likes to talk. The air tastes a sharp stone made into breath, and every plank in the boat chooses to be very well behaved. Sparks tumble down the slope like a visit from your drawer of straight pins. The helmsman steers wide, remembering that islands and tempers have habits. For your second soft joke, you invent a bedtime app called Volcano Mode, which whispers, "Yes, that is dramatic. No, we don't need to get closer." and then guides you to the calmest pillow on deck. 5 stars, push notifications disabled. You tie your coat tighter with the knot your hands now make automatically over-under through, and let the monk vowel hum in the line convince your sternum to lighten. Something drifts past that smells like resin and cinnamon in the same impossible breath. You refuse to look at anyone for fear of accusing them of smuggling pastries. The pilot grins anyway. At a quiet roadstead, you anchor under a sky that forgot to be complicated. The boat's timbers relax audibly and the world collects into small noises. You already trust water tapping the hull like a chipped cup, a jar lid sighing near the bow, a single night bird refusing to overdo it. You rest your palm on the thwart not to press, only to promise, and the wood returns a grazed warmth before forgetting you, as politely as the benches, presses, and gate rails in other lives. A boy sets a clay lamp on the thwart, and its puddle of light ripples on the boat's ribs as perfectly as the lamp on your blanket rippled over the map. The flame shows you a tablet with neat inland handwriting reefs, coves, a short comment about skies that did not want a moon that night, and the only boast a sailor should keep returned with everyone accounted for. You love the tone, you admire the restraint, you plan to borrow both in the morning. Another less attested anecdote climbs over the gunwale. Grinning, a later compiler wrote that Carthage burned certain logbooks to keep rivals from learning weather and watering holes. It's a story that flatters secrecy and governments equally. Charming, unverified. You lay it on the same shelf as the Phoenician captain who ran aground to protect his tin, and the market describes complaining wax. Even if no fire touched any page, you can feel how a city might prefer maps without coordinates and stories without the last number. Toward midnight, wind smooths itself and whispers restraint into the rigging. You can feel the mountain's low brightness to leeward, like a second lamp under a door. In your lap, a chart with tidy circles tempts your pencil into drawing one more. You hold back. This is not a night for dots. This is a night for maybes scuffed gently by a thumb into ghosts. The sea approves by taking one long collective breath. Historians still argue whether the Atlantic peoples Hanno met knew his home already by trade winds and gossip, whether he mistook familiar capes with new names, whether the periplus is proudly precise or handsomely vague. They also argue how much of our urge to pin his route comes from a modern impatience with gentleness. You decline to be impatient. You choose to be the proofreader again and write in pencil at the edge of the sky lovely, not a coastline. For your third soft joke, you promote yourself to assistant harbor master, offshore division. Benefits including the authority to declare certain horizons closed for renovations until morning. The sea, flattered, keeps its voices low, the mountain insured, continues without requiring your opinion. Dawn decides in grays before committing. The shore becomes a list of fainter smells, ash cooled by dew, figs rehearsing sugar, weeds clean as new rope. That little teaspoon of iron every honest coast puts on your tongue. A dolphin surfaces in lawful company and then minds its own business. You salute with an index finger and remember the wall-paint dolphins whose blue kept its temperature even in your palm's shadow. The world is full of cousins. You raise the anchor with a slow barrel chorus and the oars reset their manners. The helmsman kisses his teeth at a small wave, and the small wave apologizes. A single bell on shore, tinny. Deer tries one syllable and declines to audition again. Attendance, noted. Your breath matches it, shh. And the boat's wake writes a mild parenthesis around last night's volcano and then lets punctuation be punctuation. The day will carry you to a harbor where singers collect islands in verses like shells, some meadows set beyond sunset, some lucky winds, some orchards that clap for the sun, but you don't say that out loud. You keep tonight orderly in your pocket a mouth of fire, a rumor of bells under a stone, a chart that refuses to brag, a knot that kept your coat where it belonged, an oarlock's thock, a pilot's thumb that is steered by courtesy. The island other peoples claim to know remains a temperament on the air rings and rules, pride and correction, water that moves away from itself and back again, like a drawer that stops before a click. You rest your hand on the gunwale, not to push, only to promise, and the wood forgives you your love of gentle maps. You step ashore where evening smells like honey and salt, and a low fire turns figs glossy, while a lyre rests on a knee, the way a cat rests on a promise. The musician plucks a thread of bronze, a sweet sound. The string breathes the same tempo your chest does, hesh. And the crowd answers by leaning back on elbows, cups low, sandals loose. A breeze off the water lifts the fringe on a cloak. Somewhere a cup touches a tray with the modest clunk you've been collecting since pipes, keys, presses, and goat bells began cooperating with bedtime. You set your hands in your favorite posture, not touching fragile things, and let the song arrive without pushing. The singer draws a west with his voice. Not a coordinate west, more like a warm direction where the day likes to finish its sentence. He tastes it for you meadows without weather tantrums, orchards that help the sun applaud at the end of its shift, clean winds unbothered by taxes. It isn't the island you've been pretending not to draw. It is a temperament dressed as geography, a ring of grace in the far light. Your jar of not tea would settle to this. You're sure the surface is smiling, sediment keeping its counsel. Your steady fact sits in the front row and sips with dignity. Very old Greek poems place special places beyond the ordinary sea. Homer speaks of a bright plain at the ends of the earth, where a favored few live in gentler air. Hesiod imagines a shore where heroes of an earlier age enjoy fields that never bicker with their farmers. Pindar later locates the Blessed Isles beside oceans astream, their orchards and easy breezes supervised by retired gods on good behavior. Gardens in the west, apples kept in careful hands, the Hesperides belong there too, and a red island of a many-headed herdsman. Erythea grazes its myth near the coast you just left with pilots and purple dye. The lyre hums, and the sea edits the beach into softer grammar. For your first soft joke, you imagine an ancient app called Poem or Port that listens to a hexameter and says, likely vineyard, bring rope, before dozing off. 5 stars for actionable lyricism. The singer's mouth curves without breaking meter. Historians still argue whether the earliest Elysian plays in Homer is meant literally west near Ocean's River and breezy sunsets or belongs fully to the underworld, and only later drifts outward toward horizons you can sail toward if you pack biscuits. They also argue whether Hesperides and Erythea began as purely mapless myths or picked up hints from Phoenician pilots who returned with resin. cinnamon rumors, and stories about islands where evening behaves. The debate here smells like wine and thyme. The liar is generous with nods. A less attested fireside tale scoots closer to your cup. Once, a rhapsode swore that, on a calm crossing, he heard a sound like applause coming off the water at sunset, and decided orchards must clap for the sun somewhere. And he kept that line in performances until a practical aunt told him it was probably his own cloak. Charming, unverified. You set it next to drowned bells, ever-burning lamps, and the secret harbor hidden in a printer's ornamental O. Still, when the breeze ruffles the tent canvas just once, your ribs hear a low, agreeable patter and call it attendance. Cups circle. A sprig of myrtle releases a smell greener than patience. The singer knits a new verse around a west wind with a reputation for fairness. Apples appear thin-skinned, sweet with a little iron on the tongue. Your harbor teaspoon passed down the row like currency. You hold yours and consider not biting it out of respect for fresco dolphins you refuse to pet. Then you remember frescoes have none of the enzymes required for jealousy, and you take a quiet bite. At the edge of the gathering, a boy scratches a small map in sand with a reed the way your pilot in Gadir scribbled bearings on wax and puts a circle far off with a neat channel bisecting it. A child's Hy-Brasil before such a name exists. You watch him, rub it back with his palm until only a ghost remains presence. Absence, presence, the method you've come to trust for keeping stories gentle and fingers honest. Historians still argue whether poets who named Erythea near the sunset meant the Cadiz Islands specifically, or just like the taste of red islands when the sky behaved, whether some said the Hesperides near that Phoenician hill at Lixus you visited, with its fennel and stories, or farther along the map that wasn't yet a map. They also argue whether late poets wrote the Blessed Isles with a straight face, or with a wink for audiences who needed a bedtime picture more than a passport. A flute joins, two notes like cousins, soft reed echo of the shepherd's double pipe you heard in the Atlas shade, and the sea keeps time by licking the beach in measured commas. For your second soft joke, you invent a festival seating chart labeled Elysium Lawn. Heroes shaded benches, us bring cushions, and you tip your cup toward the moon for approving this sensible allocation. The moon grants an extra brightness on the rim and pretends it meant to. The singer touches the Hesperides and their apples kept by daughters with names like Evening, and everyone says, of course it was West. Where else would you keep a sunset? He mentions a dragon, briefly, as if every good orchard deserves a night watchman, and then returns to winds and meadows, because monsters are energetic for this hour. You feel the familiar monk vowel in the line hanging from the awning, and your shoulders sink by one measurable notch, the way they did before a gate hummed and a tide staff breathed and a soot line wrote peace. A less attested Aeschylean, one of those marginal whispers from later readers, claims that in a lost comedy, a character tried to sell fake maps to the Blessed Isles printed on pastry parchment, which, if true, is the best business plan never tested. Charming, unverified. You add it to your shelf for when your imaginary bakery opens on a quay and needs a product line called edible coordinates. Your steady fact keeps the room practical. Greek geography grows more precise as sailors keep accounts. but poetry keeps a different kind of precision. Moral weather, not coastal outline. Poets invite gardens and fair winds to stand in for aftercare. Even when navigators learn island names from pilots who smell resin better than any god, singers keep their distance from pins. The proofreader's pencil at the press would approve this margin note lovely, not a coastline. Historians still argue whether the Isles of the Blessed later got mapped onto real archipelagos Canaries, Madeira by travelers eager to upgrade a lyric into a route, or whether sailors tagged those places with the old names simply because a sunset will flatter any islet if you arrive humble. They also debate how much of the West in song is Phoenician rumor with Greek varnish and how much is Greek hope furnished by good fruit and calm breezes. The lyre refuses to take sides. It has decided to be agreeable for the rest of the night. The breeze brings a faint, scandalous ribbon of cinnamon from someone's pouch, your traveling spice again, and you decide not to accuse the singer of seasoning his metaphors. For your third soft joke, you imagine a rating system for afterlives. 5 apples, reliable orchard. 3 apples, excellent breeze. Weak snack options, and you award the West a quiet 5 for sound design alone. A child curls in the angle of a fishing net and falls asleep to hexameters that forget to brag. The singer lowers his voice and the verses slow their breathing until you can feel your own ribs matching them without effort. The same kind rhythm you learned from oarlocks, gates, fans, and seismograph drums that wrote boring lines you admired. The apple in your hand has grown cooler by an agreeable degree. You set it down near your knee, not to push, only to promise, and the sand returns a comfortable indentation. Far out, a buoy or a fisherman's bell gives one small note and thinks better of continuing. Attendance marked, the crowd disperses without argument. Sandals make soft punctuation up the lane. A cup rolls a little and stops with a sound like a low vowel held the right amount of time. You stand and retie the awning's loose end with your signature knot. Over, under, through. The rope purrs and your sternum purrs back. On your way to the quay, you pass a wall with painted ivy so deft you nearly lift a hand to pet a leaf. You lean close and admire the cool in the pigment. It rewards you by not aging on the spot. Somewhere behind you, a singer laughs at a joke you missed about a hero who brought the wrong apples home. You forgive yourself for not taking notes. The night smells of myrtle, charcoal, and iron on the air, a harbor teaspoon folded into lyric. Down on the stones, the water writes a softer script. You touch the mooring post not to push, only to promise, and the wood gives back a gloss of warmth before forgetting you as furniture should. The island other peoples claim to know has been attuned tonight. Not a place, a steady breeze, neat orchards, a horizon that always signs the day off in cursive. Tomorrow, a man with a stylus will tap wax and point at coasts with concrete. Tomorrow will smell like lime and sun-hot brick. For now, the West is a kindness sung to people who earned a nap. You tie that thought with a tidy half-hitch, put the apple in your pocket against unlikely dragons, and let the sea edit your steps into sleep. Noon leans on the stone, and the stone does not mind. You stand where the quay keeps its heat, like a good ledger, and the wind off the basin tastes of lime, salt, and something volcanic ground to powder pozzolana so the water agrees to hold hands with walls. Your fingers skim the air above a block scored with mason's numbers, not touching, only promising, and the edge stays cooler than your skin, politely in charge of its own temperature. Behind you, a hexagon of harbor lies so tidy, it looks like geometry built a lake and then hired ships, and every clap of wave against concrete answers your chest's metronome. With a calm that could run an empire. On a platform, a surveyor squints along a Groma cross of arms hung with plumb lines and hangs the city on strings. He lifts, turns, waits, and the lines settle like well-trained swallows, cousins of the fresco birds you refused to pet. At his feet, a boy turns a wax tablet to catch the sun just so, then touches a stylus to its skin increments you could hum. A song of a stadia, a patience of angles. For your first soft joke, you imagine the instrument chirping. You are aligned, hydrate, and the surveyor ignoring it with professional grace. The wax absorbs his refusal as a compliment. Your steady fact arrives in the plain sandals of an engineer Roman builders mix that volcanic ash with lime and aggregate to make hydraulic concrete. It hardens underwater and lets them float out cofferdams, pour breakwaters, and teach the sea to use inside voices. At Cosa, at Caesarea, on a coast that loves drama. Here at Portus beside the older harbor of Ostia, the ocean learns to be furniture, and in rooms with Morse scrolls than biscuits, people like Strabo and Pliny write the blue into prose pillars reset as a straight. Islands catalogued by dogs or figs or winds, the fortunate isles given a footnote with weather. The hexagon basin blinks sunlight from angle to angle, proud of how efficiently it stacks ships. You move to the lip, set your palm on the rail not to push, only to promise, and the concrete gives back a dry warmth before forgetting you, like a bench with a degree in boundaries. A single bell tinny, deer tries one syllable from a barge and then minds itself. Attendance marked. The sound joins your collection of polite percussions from pipes, goat bells, oarlocks, and bookshop doors. You feel richer by a notch on your private tide staff. A clerk with a good haircut reads out names and weights, and the words behave: Hispania, olive oil; Africa, grain; Egypt, papyrus; Asia Minor, marble. He pricks his stylus into wax with the same quiet ferocity a proofreader used on a press sheet when he penciled morel, not topographic, in the margin. Here, the moral is quantity. On a wall, red letters chalk the positions of ships the way a scribe at Sais wrote floods down a rod. You like that everyone trusts numbers that stay tidy under the thumb. Historians still argue whether Latin mentions of Canaria, the Isle of Dogs, refer to big canids that made a good emblem, or monk seals that made a better story, and whether Pliny's Gorgades should be Cape Verde, or proof that hair-raising tales travel in packs. They also argue whether Ptolemy's grid, compiled under the empire's patient bureaucracy, borrowed a prime line from the Fortunate Isles, or imposed its own convenience on the map, and how many later cartographers knitted errors from those coordinates into whole cardigans of phantom capes. The basin licks its edges with unlurid discipline while they discuss. Geometry is not threatened by opinion. A less attested dockside rumor saunters over with a peel of orange in its teeth. A diver once told a customs official he saw column bases like a drowned courtyard off Gadir at a very low tide. Then swore a bell rang once as if a plaza wanted to be counted. Charming, unverified, you lay it on your maybe shelf beside drowned vespers, ever-burning lamps, and the printer's secret harbor tucked in an ornamental O. Still, your ribs accept a low note from somewhere, the long monk vowel your ropes hum. When knot and cleat approve the plan, and you check the coil at your feet because habits deserve applause. Beyond the hexagon, the older harbor of Ostia yawns with the ease of a retiree. Its lighthouse points at distance like a retired centurion disciplining clouds. Along the mole, men in tunics drag nets that smell like algebra applied to fish. The air holds that teaspoon of iron you have been tasting since Athens, since Sais, since Cretan rooms where dolphins taught you to breathe. The empire's recipe for salt includes it as a non-negotiable spice. For your second soft joke, you propose a new fragrance. Eau de pozzolana hints of lime, confidence, and the small bureaucracy and the longshoreman nearby smirks without knowing why. In a shaded portico, a mosaic map lays rivers as black threads, towns as seats, the tabula. The idea of the tabula exists here as a corridor-length suggestion, a roadmap stretching like a seam across the empire's tunic. It does not love coasts, it adores milestones. It is the opposite of the lyric West listened to on a beach with a lyre. You pad along the tesserae with careful soles and read a little line for gades, your gadir gone Latin, and a decorative name for sunset meadows. Fortunate stitched into the border like embroidery, everyone swears is accurate because it looks tidy. Historians still argue whether Roman writers truly cared about the Atlantic beyond trade and glory reports, tin, purple, voyages safe, or whether some kept an active, jealous curiosity about distant islands that poetry had softened. They also argue whether the empire's taste for order fertilized or anesthetized. The myths did lists like this turn orchards into addresses, or did addresses cultivate better orchards in language? The mosaic does not budge. It knows its job is to be walked upon while making sandals sound clever. A survey crew rattles past with a chorobate's long wooden level with a water channel on their shoulders. Aqueduct plans lie rolled under one arm like fishing poles. Someone writes a number on a wax slab and blows on it as if cooling soup. You love how all these tools perform kindness by keeping things flat, true, and sober. For your third soft joke, you picture a Roman app called Level-Headed, which notifies you when the world tilts and then provides a cat video that has survived 2,000 years. The Groma refuses to laugh and hangs perfectly plumb, which is its idea of comedy. Down at the quay, a ship from Mauritania kisses a fender and your hands answer without consulting you. Over under through the signature knot takes the bollard and purrs that small vowel you've taught your sternum to imitate. A centurion, off duty, tries to show a child how to splice. The child shows the centurion how to listen to row. Both leave equal pride in the distrand. You like that empire's boo to knots now and then. Your steady fact puts on a scholar's cloak and quotes coordinates Ptolemy, riding under Rome's umbrella, grids the earth with latitude and longitude, catalogs places with numbers, and sets the map up for future arguments with admirable thoroughness. Later scribes will copy and smudge. Translators will flip east and west by accident or habit, and medieval copyists will tilt islands like falling figs. The kindness here is the attempt to see, to count, to place, to be bored properly. Historians still argue whether lists of the Fortunate Isles later attached to the Canaries because somebody finally noticed good breezes and mild fruit there, or because names love to stick to weather that flatters them. They also argue if Roman concrete lost to silting because rivers are relentless, or because engineers rested on the comfort of heroic materials and forgot that harbors need diets. The basin, hexagonal and the stubborn, accepts both as a fair critique and continues to hold ships like a palm holds seeds. A less attested marginal story arrives with a stain of wine. A certain governor, tired of dinner guests promoting the drowned island, posted a notice, "No Atlantis" at table, and found, to his grief, that everyone had more fun, charming, unverified. You would dine with him anyway, if only to hear the silence between courses, where a bell might have rung once and then retired. The afternoon salants. A gull walks with managerial calm down a rope and pretends to slip, strictly for applause. You study a warehouse door where a chalk graphic rings and channels decorates a merchant's seal, not the island you refuse to pin, but the family resemblance you have been carrying, a taste for order that likes water to behave. The door sighs on its hinges with that exact low vowel your ears have filed under competence. You bring out your page protector, the one you slid a satellite print into on another night, and set it gently on a crate to weigh a corner of the foreman's table. He doesn't notice. The page behaves as if it belongs. You write a tiny dot at the margin beside a note that reads, "Fortunate lovely," not a coastline, then rub it with your thumb until it becomes the ghost of a dot. Presence, absence, presence. You are a proofreader again, but with sunlight and lime dust instead of lamp and ink. Toward evening, a barge noses out of the hexagon, and a fan of ripples taps the concrete in time with your breath. A child asks why the harbor is a shape and not just a hole, and a mason says, because shapes are easier to remember than holes, which is the finest engineering proverb you've heard in weeks. The child nods, ties a very poor knot, and grins at the rope when it pretends to hold anyway. Good rope humors beginners. You turn toward the road that leaves the harbor, the one the mosaic loves more than all the seas, and feel how your souls like milestones as much as your eyes like horizons. Far off, fog will keep its Celtic appointment, and a map will crackle under your palm, and a bell hundreds of miles from here will give one good syllable and a stop. For now, Rome measures the blue with a string and patience. Poets keep gardens in reserve. Pilots ride winds as if borrowing manners from fans. And your jar of not tea tucked in your bag approves of every plan that clarifies slowly. You touch the rail not to push, only to promise, and walk up into a street that smells of sun-hot brick. Olive oil thinking about a supper, and the faint teaspoon of iron that makes all honest cities taste a little like harbors. The basin behind you edits itself back to background, the way drawers should close and bells should keep silent once roll call is done. You breathe with it and carry forward a grid, a knot, a ghost of a dot, and enough gentle geometry to sleep on. Fog pins itself to the headlands like wool left on a thorn, and the lane down to the pier smells of iodine and peat smoke and rain that has changed its mind twice already. Your coat drinks the damp and remains politely heavy. Your fingers, which have learned to be good citizens, press a crackled chart flat on a barrel with a pebble anchored by your signature knot, over, under, through, so the paper doesn't decide to practice kites. The lamp in the watch hut shines a small orange moon on the oilskin and makes the sea lanes look as if they're being written now. Your breath keeps the harbor meter. And somewhere in the white, a bell gives one restrained syllable and stands down. Attendance, as ever, complete. The chart has a good memory for grease and stains. Someone has drawn a neat circle west of here and rubbed it into a ghost with a thumb. Presence, absence. Presence, the margin method your proofreader friend taught you. You hover your hand above that pale ring, not touching, only promising, and feel the paper's chill suggest latitude without insisting. Behind you, ropes talk to their cleats in small monk vowels. The pier returns your step, like bread remembering the oven. If the dolphins painted in the island rooms could swim this air, they would only blink once and continue through it, pretending not to be surprised by weather. Your steady fact sits down on the barrel with a damp cap and practical boots for centuries. Many maps placed an island called Hy-Brasil or Brazil. Brazil west of Ireland, sometimes as a ring split by a channel, sometimes as a dot, often wandering from chart to chart like a well-meaning cat. Sailors and collectors knew the name, later printers kept it out of habit. Phantom islands behave like that when they get into the filing system. Fog helps, and mirage helps Fata Morgana lift in low rock into architecture, ships into cities, the horizon into a shelf. Your jaw tastes iron the way honest coasts do. The chart tastes faintly of lamp smoke and dried salt. A gull pads along the rail, looks over your shoulder at the circle, and makes the editorial noise professional birds reserve for rumors. For your first soft joke, you invent a local service called Fogcast, which predicts visibility with 3 options: nope, mostly, nope, and bring biscuits. The gull accepts bring biscuits as sound science and wanders off to conduct field work. A coil tightens itself a sigh and behaves. Historians still argue whether the name Hy-Brasil owes more to a medieval Irish word for a noble clan or to a red dye wood that later lent its name elsewhere. They also argue whether reports of the island were honest mirage, wishful repetition, or navigators practicing the art of not disappointing their patrons with blank water. Some argue that the neat ring with a bisecting a street came from one draftsman's afternoon geometry that appealed to others' sense of order because order photographs well on maps. The fog registers neutrality. It has other jobs. A less attested anecdote yanks its stool up to the barrel and sets down a dripping hat. One 17th century tale says a captain landed on Hy-Brasil, met courteous inhabitants with tidy cattle, and returned with gold. Later rumor adds black rabbits and an old man who liked maps. Charming, unverified, likely a literary prank. You shelve it with drowned plaza bells, ever-burning lamps, and the printer's secret harbor inside the ornamental O. Still, the way the bell out in the white rings once and then keeps boundaries makes you feel as if some unhurried island has counted you. The keeper brings you a sweet tea strong enough to brag and puts a finger to the glass of the hut's window, where the lens blooms a circle of light onto the fog and back again like a thoughtful heartbeat. Far out to the southwest, a headland breathes and then reconsiders. Tide curls along the bay with the discretion you like, from drawers that close without a click. For your second soft joke, you picture a tourist sign at the cliff Hy-Brasil tour, delayed by century. Please enjoy local rock. And the cliff thanks you by not shedding anything inconvenient. Your steady fact goes on quietly. Legends along this coast keep drowned lands close at hand. The Welsh speak of Cantre'r Gwaelod, a sunken lowland in Cardigan Bay tended by a negligent gatekeeper. Cornish voices keep Lyonesse between here and the Scillies, a last country of orchards swallowed when bells refuse to be punctual. The consensus is that sea level has never promised to remain where grandparents left it, and that post-glacial margins and a storm-cut sand can rearrange a family's relationship with fields. Bells ring once in a stories because it is tidier to grieve when attendance is quick. Historians still argue whether those drownedland stories preserve a grain memory of real coasts stepping back after the last cold age, or whether they are moral furniture arranged by later writers, or whether both are true in pleasing proportions. They also argue which headlands breed the best mirage Irish, Scottish, Basque, and whether particular sightings of islands were the low exposed bits of Porcupine Bank preening under odd refraction. The argument smells of wet wool and whiskey. The bell remains firm in its policy of minimalism. You walk the pier. The boards give back that old clonk just where you hope they will. A man in a knit cap pulls a chart from his coat, laminated, resigned, and taps a penciled dot west of any rock he'll admit. Seen often, missed often, he says. A phrase so perfect you want to sew it onto a cushion in a library where maps learn to nap. You think of the press proof marked moral, not topographic, and decide this man is the honorary proofreader of oceans. A less attested kitchen rumor slides in. Steaming in the village up the coast, they say. A family keeps a jar of sand that, when shaken, sounds like distant bells from underwater, but only at neap tide and only if you do not speak to it. Charming, unverified, you place it beside your jar of not tea, which, being trained in decorum, murmurs nothing. Still, your wrist has a memory of jars that clarify when left alone, and the tea approves of all plans that involve patience. The fog thins without apologizing, and you see, briefly, a gray shape draw itself like a careful eyebrow on the water, then release. The gull rejoins you to claim vindication by committee. For your third soft joke, you propose an award show Best Supporting Mirage, Most Ethical Phantom Island, and Lifetime Achievement in Not Being There. Hy-Brasil, predictably, is absent but sends thanks. The fog accepts on its behalf. Your steady fact shifts to a different kind of West monks, wrote about a saint who sailed in a coracle and found islands with singing and peculiarly cooperative wildlife. Later compilers gave him a map painted by faith. The consensus is that some voyagers reached real archipelagos, the Faroes, Iceland, maybe a corner of the Canaries, and that St. Brendan's Isle joined the repertoire of polite maybes in the wide water. The fog is fine with saints. It keeps the same office hours. Historians still argue whether specific medieval Brendan sightings tie to certain real islands, to floating seaweed mats, or to narrative needs, and whether the Sea of Darkness label on later charts arrived from Arab navigators via Latin readers or from European dramatists who like their edges crisp. They also argue whether the island you're standing on right now, this momentary peninsula of planks in fog, counts as real, which is mostly a joke you tell your coat when it is very damp. The keeper shows you a half-rolled sounding sheet numbers, behaving like tidy pasture marks taken from a boat that grumbles and obeys. Sound tells a different truth than sight lows and flats, banks and holes, a shy staircase to nowhere. You run your finger an inch above the paper lines and think of the seismograph's skinny diary, the tide staff's black vertebrae, the gate that hummed with monk vowels, the press that clapped its pages dry. Boring miracles again, and you are grateful. A buoy farther out finds its tongue one clear ding and putters back to silence. A child on the slipway counts one with great seriousness and then forgets what comes after, which seems philosophically sound tonight. The knit-capped man grins at you and says, "If you see Hy-Brasil, tell it I owe it a net," which is the kind of debt that improves everyone's mood. Your signature knot approves by staying exactly as taut as it needs to be. No more. The fog lifts by inches your cheekbones can measure. Headlands braid back into cliffs. A line of cliffs learns again to be plural. Your chart dries enough to fold along the crease the lamp taught it. You rub the ghost circle once more, not to erase it, just to remind it of its job be lovely, not a coastline. The bell, consistent in its policies, remains silent because it has already counted you. You walk up the lane. Peat smoke remembers your coat for you. Somewhere a kitchen remarks on cinnamon in a pudding. You refuse to investigate because time will carry that ribbon to another room under a lattice with mint tea and copper lamps. And it's good to let surprises arrive on schedule. A door trades you the damp for wool and warmth. A dog explains at length what it knows about tides. A boot scrapes itself polite. At the table by the window, you set the chart to nap and lay a pebble on the corner like a paper pillow. Your jar of not tea waits in the bag, perfectly opaque and unsurprised. You add a tiny pencil note to the margin, seen often, missed often, and imagine a pressman somewhere smiling around a teacup. You breathe in HH and out ish and listen to the last thin threads of fog pull themselves free of the harbor like careful knitters tidying yarn. Tomorrow you will sit under patterned wood, where a navigator draws the sea of darkness onto sand with a reed and names stars like sensible furniture. You will taste mint and copper and hear another kind of bell in a language that keeps good books. Tonight, this coast tells you what you needed, why an island can be known only sort of by weather and manners, by the single ring of a bell and a pebbled circle rubbed to a ghost while everybody sleeps just fine. The pier remembers your step. The rope hums its small vowel. The lamp folds its moon and rests. You turn the latch not to push, only to promise and let the drawer of night close without a click. Mint cools your tongue while heat coils in the cup, and the lattice above you turns sunlight into a patient grit that feels like a map that has decided to become a shadow. Copper lamps breathe out a spice cardamom, a smudge of clove, and their warm light puddles on a shallow tray of sand where a captain draws coastlines with a reed. The room's wood smells of orange peel and salt. Beyond the open arch, rigging murmurs like wind threading a comb, and somewhere a bell gives one restrained syllable attendance and stops. The same good manners you've met on piers and in shops and on barges that decline to grandstand. Your chest answers in the rhythm your fan taught it on the first night, and the lattice animates the walls with drifting squares like tiny sails you do not need to reef. The captain's hand moves with the quiet authority of a proofreader who knows where commas like to live. He draws the line of a familiar strait with a single stroke, then opens it to ocean. Bar al-Zulumat. He says, sea of darkness, and the words taste soft and green in your mouth, not spooky so much as polite about their limits. He dots a crescent of isles just beyond Al-Khalidat, the fortunate, and sets a reed mark for Gadir, because some habits cross alphabets without needing passports. The sand accepts the lines and does not brag. Your palms hover, not touching, only promising, and the tray glows like a low-tide beach trained to stay indoors. Your steady fact takes the corner cushion and sits upright like a good student. Medieval Arab and Andalusi writers called the Atlantic the Green Sea or the Sea of Darkness, a water with fog and distance that did not favor easy crossings. Al-Mas'udi wrote of its width and shadows. In 1154, Al-Idrishi, working in Palermo for Roger II, compiled a great book and a disc map that included the Canary Islands and other Macaronesian hints. Geography in Arabic kept their names and weather as calm paragraphs rather than oaths. You sip and nod because tidy paragraphs are Bedtime's favorite furniture. He draws a second cluster Madeira outward, a cape with its own personality inward, and then smooths the sand with the side of his palm. Presence into absence into presence. The method you have been trusting since you practiced rubbing a ghost ring at a foggy quay. For your first soft joke, you imagine a navigator's app in dark mode called Zulumat, which pops up at sunset and purrs. Brightness lowered. Hydrate. Do not annoy headlands. 5 stars. Elegant settings. No bragging. Historians still argue whether Al-Idrisi's tale of the Mughari Run, the adventurers, a handful of young men from Lisbon who sailed west and reportedly found islands and captors, records real voyages to Madeira or the Canaries, or floats as literature designed to spice a geography with marvels. They also argue how far Arab pilots in the Maghreb went routinely into that ocean beyond trade to the islands, whether they preferred hugging coasts and currents, or whether their Sea of Darkness notes hit quiet familiarity. The captain taps the reed on the sand as if punctuating a sentence. The lamp trembles once and then behaves. A less attested story pads in wearing dusty boots. Later writers speak of Kashkash of Cordoba, who, in the 9th century, supposedly sailed into the west and returned with unknown goods. Charming, debated, cherished by enthusiasts, you file it with drowned plaza bells and ever-burning lamps and that ornamental O with a secret harbor. Still, when a wind shift carries a ribbon of cinnamon through the arch as if pastry were a kind of weather, you feel your shoulders settle by one notch on your private tied staff. Rumors, like spices, improve rooms even when they aren't dinner. He sets the reed aside and lifts a brass astrolabe from a cloth, its plates engraved with the star wheels dense as beehives. The metal is the temperature of recent sun. Your fingers hover, respectful, while he shows how a star's height becomes a line you can trust. Al-Jadi, He says Polaris, Suhail. He says Canopus, the southern lantern that Indian Ocean sailors love. He slides a little wooden card on a knotted cord from his sleeve, the kamal, and holds it to his cheekbone, lining the edge to the star's ghost in daylight to show you the trick. You think of your jar of not tea, clarifying all on its own the same faith that quiet devices deserve hold. A line. Wait. For your second soft joke, you imagine a 2-tab instrument on his workbench, Qibla and currents. One side telling you where prayer faces, the other where wind has chosen to be reasonable. The captain approves by not laughing. The astrolabe approves by shining with exactly the right amount of pride. Outside, a rope hums a small monk vowel, and the boy on the quay answers it with a tidy loop that would make your signature knot applaud if knots had hands. Historians still argue whether the magnetic compass arrived in these harbors by the 13th century from China through interwoven markets, or whether a starlight and kamal ruled longer. They also argue whether Arab accounts of Atlantic islands preserved independent sightings or reframed earlier Greek and Latin notes in new, organized prose. The argument is civil enough to sit on the carpet and drink mint. You pour another cup, the steam writes cursive in the lamplight and erases itself with perfect manners. The captain dusts a new line in the sand for a current that slides south along the Moroccan coast, the river within the sea, then a counter that runs inland. He names a city that tastes like salt and plaster on your tongue. He sketches a harbor with a single bell you can practically hear. The bell, respectful of timely cameo appearances, does indeed ring once from beyond the lattice and then chooses a contemplative silence. He lists winds, shamal, nashi, Elise like cousins at a wedding, each with a preferred seating arrangement. In a corner, a boy copies the names onto a wax tablet with the same care the market described it in Gadir, stylus clicking gently. You love that every civilization you've walked through counts, with soft sounds read on sand, stylus on wax, pencil on margin, soot needle on drum, drawer sliding in without a click. Logistics is always a lullaby if you let it be. A less attested mariner's rumor smuggles itself into the doorway with a grin under a new moon. Some say the Atlantic sometimes sings a low. Even note where the canary current combs a shelf, the sea of darkness trying a monk chant. Charming, unverified. You place it beside the cave bell under lava shores and the marsh gates humming steel. Your ribs, faithless and happy, hum back anyway. Your steady fact keeps you honest. Arab navigators were at their most at home across the Indian Ocean. Dhows riding monsoon cycles. Pilots steering by Suhail and by star paths remembered as poems. Kamal cords tied in knots like beads for latitudes, and their books record that competence in tables and verses. Yet along the Maghreb and into Al-Andalus, they wrote about this western water, too, giving its coasts thought-out names and telling sensible distances in days at sea. These are map people and margin people. You recognize their handwriting in your bones. Historians still argue whether the Fortunate Isles in Arabic texts map exactly onto the Canaries and Madeira as we use the names now, or whether some writers kept the old Greek eudaimon mood and pinned it wherever weather felt generous. They also argue whether Al-Idrisi's palace workshop gathered fresh pilot chatter from ports like Ceuta and Lisbon, or mostly massaged older lists into a new beautiful order under Norman patronage. The reed draws a ring and a channel, a temptingly neat island you know better than to pet, and the captain rubs it back to a ghost with the side of his hand. Proof that he is of your sect, lovely, not a coastline. For your third soft joke, you propose a sailor's loyalty program for monsoon seasons, earn date points, redeem for better ropes, and the captain, who understands economies and theologies, nods gravely as if he has just approved a sensible fatwa on snacks. The lamp applauds by not flickering. The mint applauds by being cold, even when hot. Outside, a muezzin's call floats over the harbor in a line so level your astrolabe could balance on it. The captain sets the instrument down not to push, only to promise, and the brass returns a film of a sunset warmth before becoming just metal again. You feel the old curve of your proofreader's pencil in your hand and, without actual pencil, you annotate the air in front of you moral, not topographic. A young sailor repeats a wind list under his breath the way another child counted letters in a market across the Strait. Songs are the same shape everywhere when they have work to do. The reed draws east for a moment, chasing a memory that smells like pepper and coconut. He names Aden and Socotra and Gujarat the way a person recites family. You taste a future section by accident temple bells that travel across a surf, steps that go down the stairs into green and catch yourself before you get there too quickly. The room waits with you. No rush. He smooths his tray and folds the cloth over it with care a conservator would admire, the way a scribe covered a scroll or a pressman laid muslin over type. In the doorway, a boy practice throws a loop and misses. The rope humors him with a pretend catch. Your signature knot approves from your sleeve, certain it will be needed in a moment regardless. You stand, and the lattice trades patterned shadow for open light the way a drawer closes without noise. Copper sighs on its hook, mint clears its throat and subsides. The captain touches the sand lightly, not to push, only to promise, and the sand keeps his fingerprint for one heartbeat before becoming beach again. Outside, a small, polite bell decides you are still present and rings once. Attendance? Again? Complete? The alley toward the harbor smells of cumin and wet rope. The sea has decided to be green for the hour. A dhow shifts, its planks talking in the same quiet vowels that docks from Gadir to Ostia consider proper. In your ear, the word monsoon opens like a folding fan, and you feel wind from a far shore testing the frames of a temple over water. Bells rehearsing for evening, steps disappearing into a tide that is not in a hurry to leave. You carry the astrolabe's cool memory, a knotted cord's practical mercy, a ring in the sand rubbed into a ghost, and a promise to keep letting maps enjoy their margins. You breathe and follow the lane to a quay where saffron and rain can hold the same sentence without arguing. Monsoon air brushes your wrists like a cool cloth that someone keeps dipping in far rain and wringing out over the coast. The alley opens and the sea stands there, slate green and busy, carrying bells on its back notes that ride the foam in single, patient syllables and then lie down. Attendance, the water says, and retreats with decent modesty. Your breath chooses the harbor meter, and the wind threads it through palm fronds until the trees keep time without looking like they were trying. Lanterns along the promenade turn their small circles of light into islands. Beyond them, blacker shapes break the surface and go still, like steps that forgot to stop at the sand. You come to a railing that smells of salt and rust, and behind it, the shore temple sits with its shoulders to the surf. Stone worn to velvet by centuries of weather, and people who've learned not touching the way you have. Its spires are the color of wet almonds. Its edges hold that peculiar cool that old masonry shares with night water and museum cases. You hover a palm a breath above the carved granite, not to push, only to promise, and the stone appreciates your manners by holding the stiller, if that's possible. Spray mists your face and tastes faintly of iron, the teaspoon you have collected from honest harbors all along this trip. Someone's a stall sends a thin ribbon of cinnamon that refuses to respect geography and time zones. Your steady fact stands beside you in the salt wind and tucks hair behind one ear, like a librarian who also lifts stones. The great shore temple at Mamallapuram, Mahabalipuram, belongs to the Pallavas of the 8th century CE, a complex facing the Bay of Bengal with shrines for Shiva and Vishnu and courtyards that learned to accept sea wash as part of the schedule. Sailors from the south and from farther off knew this headland by its towers. Later visitors wrote of 7 pagodas, a name that made a tidy myth of more spires than today's. Inland, monolithic rathas, rock-cut chariots practice being architecture in miniature, and even the goats seem to respect their floor plans. Steps slip down toward the surf from a platform like a staircase that believes in optimism. The water reaches, rehearses, and it steps down again, drawer closing without a click. For your first soft joke, you imagine a local gym named Steps to Nowhere. Membership perk, calm calves, and excellent humility, and your signature knot tying towels to rails during the storm season. The knot warm in your palm hums a small monk vowel that your eternum answers at once. You walk the boundary path where carved balls keep their own weather. The stone Nandis are patient, noses salt polished by air alone. You pet the air beside one, the way you petted fresco swallows and the stone ripples, and the delta rod's black marks. On the seaward side, dark shapes in the shallows sit at low tide like shy furniture. Locals point old wall, one says, old steps, says another, and your body remembers a harbor city asleep beneath silt. Coins waiting in green hush, a carved elbow under drifting light. The sea here, less coy, sometimes lays out a few pieces when it feels like setting a table. Historians still argue whether the old phrase 7 pagodas records a whole line of vanished shore shrines now drowned, or simply enlarges what travelers saw these 2 spires. The inland rathas into a round tail with auspicious arithmetic. They also argue whether certain blocks offshore are fully man-made or stones reorganized by tide and wishful sight. A more recent chapter carries debates of its own when the sea withdrew suddenly one winter and returned with fury. It pulled sand off the foreshore long enough for witnesses to see pedestals, walls, perhaps a small shrine base. Afterward, divers and archaeologists trace alignments in that near water, the beginnings of a grammar. How much is temple? How much is terrace? How much is seaplane with punctuation? The shore can live with maybes. A less attested legend walks up the beach barefoot and asks for a place on your shelf. Fishermen here tell of bells that ring below on very still nights. One low, regular note as if a drowned gopuram kept vespers where crabs attend. Charming, unverified, you file it beside the marsh bell, the lava cave's drum, the plaza underwater, and the ornamental O with a secret harbor. Still, when a wave slaps a step at the right angle, your ribs accept a humble syllable and call it good. The temple's outer wall carries carved panels where figures keep motion at a humane tempo. A slab shows a couching lion who, like all lions who have spent time near coasts, refuses to roar after dusk. The granite is warm one moment, cooled the next by a spray. Your fingertips feel temperature in the air as a tide of degrees. The fan at home would approve of the pacing. The soot drum from that instrument room would trace a flat, confident line for this calm between bursts. Another steady fact travels down the coast and back up into your pocket farther west. At Dwarka in Gujarat, underwater surveys have mapped structures in the shallows walls and possible jetty lines near a city that literature puts into Krishna's household story. Modern hands have lifted anchors and pottery from the region and argued dates with survey charts and caution. Offshore, Bet Dwarka has yielded more hints. Anchors, stone, stubborn sand. You think of the Priplus you read to night birds, the way pilots stitched place into prose, and you let the Arabian Sea's cousin drift into this East Coast courtyard, like a helpful relative who uses your cutting board and washes it after. Historians still argue whether Dwarka's underwater blocks belong to a historic harbor town adjusted by storms and subsidence, or whether enthusiasm has let epic time lean too hard against archaeology, and whether Pumpuhar, Kaveripattinam, farther south, met its end by river and sea, or by the way stories prefer single events to long, boring undoings. Scholars, being awake, enjoy the argument. You, being sleepward, let the breeze file everything into a folder labeled kindly unresolved. The tide signs below in cursive and erases its own signature on a healthier schedule. For your second soft joke, you imagine a monsoon mode on your imaginary app set toggle on, and your device whispers, "We will be late on purpose. Tie things with your best knot. Drink something warm. Look at the steps without using them. 5 stars. Reliable forecasts. Sponsored by towels." A vendor nearby sells paper cones of tea biscuits. You buy one and pretend for 2 seconds it is a pile of architectural fragments before responsibly eating it. A guide with the calm of a person who has seen many storms points toward a low stretch where blocks lie like a sentence with half its consonants rubbed out. He describes a year when divers found a row of sockets that looked like they had once held wooden beams, and you imagine the beams breathing when the sea learned new opinions. He keeps his hands behind his back like a conservator. You approve with both your librarian heart and your scribe's patience. A less attested traveler's boast sidles close with wet ankles. An old Portuguese pilot wrote that he moored by the 7th pagoda, as if he had counted domes and given the sea a tally. Charming, unverified, possibly a translation of weather into prestige. You place it beside the Phoenician, who allegedly beached his tin route to confuse competitors, and the governor who banned Atlantis at dinner because conversation improved. Your shelf is now a generous pantry of rumors seasoned with assault. Your steady fact comes back to the stones in front of you. These carvings Durga, water lions, pilasters, with their cool geometry carry Pallava hands in their grammar. The stylists etched wave pleasers that do not fear wave wash. At high surge, water comes into the courtyard and sits there like a visiting ant. The temple accepts it with serious hospitality. You register the practice in your body when weather comes into the room. You make space and call it guest. Later, you mop. Later still, you keep telling the story without making it heroic every time. Historians still argue whether all those ancient city-drowning tales you've carried Helik in the Gulf of Corinth, ports under sand at deltas, drowned lands off western coasts combine here in listeners' heads to make easy metaphors, or whether human brains just like to rhyme shore with shore. They also argue whether the phrase Sea of Darkness belonged here in local mouths or arrived via traders. The bells along the shore decline to clarify. One rings exactly once as if to say, present, and returns to breath. For your third soft joke, you think up a souvenir shop item you would actually buy: Provenance candles, smells of salt, granite, and patient lime, with a limited edition called Millimeter, which is just the scent of brass benchmarks and quiet competence. You would give one to the tie-the-staff if it had a desk. A child running past steals your biscuit cone, which resolves the question of architecture versus a snack. Evening lays itself down as if it has been rehearsing on a yoga mat. The temple's silhouette goes from almond to ink. Lanterns on the promenade become more important than philosophy for a while. You coil a select line for the vendor who trusts you, and your signature knot does its good work with minimal drama. The rope purrs the monk vowel, small enough you don't have to share it with anyone. A woman at the rail tosses marigolds toward a wave. The flowers roll, consider, and then tuck themselves between two steps like polite guests. Down the shore, a stone lion is now half sea, half lion. The water writes its biography in short, wet sentences, and retreats to edit. You think of other editors: the scribe at Sais with his beam of light, the pressman with his morale, not topographic pencil, the navigator who smoothed sand with the side of his hand, the satellite team that erased phantoms with gentle certainty, the seismograph needle that ignored drama and wrote asleep. Everything in your week has been an editor that respects its subject. You rest two fingers lightly on the rail, not to push, only to promise, and the salt-painted iron returns a little of the day's heat before becoming responsibly forgetful. The air smells of cumin moving toward a supper, of wet granite, of the little flash of iron every coastline puts on the tongue, and impossibly, persistently of cinnamon, which you have decided is simply how good rumors keep healthy circulation. The bell does not ring again because it knows it has done enough. The stairs that lead to water are now mostly water. Your eyes smile at their patience. In your bag, the jar of knot tea sits like a portable tide pool. Layers steady. You imagine lowering it to the first riser and letting it learn a new humidity. Then decide jars deserve home routines. The lanterns along the curve of shore ripple their calm circles and keep boats company. You look past them at dark water and see, for a blink, a line of foam suggests a wall. Then the line forgets its ambition and goes back to being breath. Lovely, not a coastline. You turn toward a street where the air is warm and windows behave like little stages. Somewhere farther along the monsoon edge, temple bells travel across a surf to a city that swears it knows a drowned plan. Somewhere west, a jetty in a green sea hums. Somewhere north, fog checks itself against a cliff and comes away improved. You keep tonight's steps as a gentle proof of concept. A civilization can know an island sort of by the way it treats edges built in for weather, letting water into rooms without panic, greeting bells with one syllable, and then going about dinner. Your breath agrees, shh, and you walk with it, carrying a knot, a rumor, a patience, and the cool of carved granite on your skin like a promise that requires no signature. Heat leaves the coast and you travel inland in the cool left behind, following a brown thread of river until the air loses its salt and gains the smell of baked clay and lamp smoke, the scent of the stories that learned to be hard. A doorway as tall as good silence opens into a tablet room where the temperature has decided to be responsible, and shelves keep their backs straight under rows of small rectangular moonlets. A wick breathes, the flame bows once, and shadows line up obediently across wedges of writing tiny mountains, tiny rivers, tiny winds captured by a reed pressed into damp clay and then given to a kiln that taught them to remember. Your chest answers the room with the meter it has kept since the map first rippled your blanket. Balk, and even the kiln's ghost seems to breathe on that schedule. A scribe shows you the gesture: grip the reed at an angle, press, lift, turn triangles born of pressure, grammar born of patience. You hover a hand a breath above a tablet, not touching, only promising, and feel the cool move into your palm as if the tablet were a stone bench with news. The room smells faintly of bitumen and linen, with a ribbon, yes, again of cinnamon that should not be here, and yet has the nerve to attend this meeting all the same. In the corner, a soot drum you recognize from another life, narrow paper taught across a cylinder, waits for tremors it hopes not to hear, ready to write boring peace in a thin, steady line. Your steady fact settles on a shelf with a librarian's posture in this land between rivers. Flood stories took careful shape long before our map learned to fold. The Sumerian king list pauses at a line, then the flood, and begins again. The tale of Atrahasis tells of a wise man warned to build. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves Utnapishtim's account on tablet Nimnint. A great boat and birds sent over water to ask the day what kind it planned to be. Much later, in the 19th century, excavators at Nineveh uncovered part of a royal library. A young Assyriologist, George Smith, read the flood lines in 1872 and felt the old stories interlock. He reportedly rushed about the room in a fit of wonder. Your version retains only the part that keeps us all comfortable, delighted, probably loud, possibly alarming to his waistcoat. Historians still argue whether these Mesopotamian flood tales memorize a particular catastrophic inundation, perhaps around beloved river towns like Shurapak, or a chorus of seasonal undoings staged as one drama, whether a layer of river-borne silt at certain tells certifies a single event, or merely a long habit of water doing grammar without asking. They also argue whether Greek ears, through travelers, through Babylonian scholars visiting courts, carried any of this cadence into later philosophy, or whether similarity is simply the way human minds file weather. The tablets do not mind They have tides of their own light across wedges, cool into palms, a margin of silence that edits eager questions down to manners. A less attested dig house legend pads into the room, wearing dust, and pride workers in an old season swore that, on afternoons when the oven warmed for a demonstration firing, a shelf of tablets exhaled a smell like river breath, as if clay, remembering flood, gave back a syllable. Charming, unverified, you shelve it beside drowned plaza bells, ever-burning lamps at Sais, the lava cavia's hidden gong, the printer's ornamental O with a secret harbor, and the jar of not tea that clarifies when left alone. Still, when a draft moves across your wrist, it does carry a cool sweetness like water with polite opinions. On a table, a little boat model, reed strokes pressed into clay tilts forever on a kiln-made wave. You resist petting it. Your diploma in not touching fragile things glows faintly like a tide mark. For your first soft joke, you imagine an ancient app called Architect, which offers a dozen tasteful hull plans with ratings like bird-friendly roof and 2-donkey aisle, then crashes because the storage is full of grain inventories. 5 stars, excellent puns, unreliable sink. A curator opens a drawer so slowly that it becomes a lullaby, no click, and sets out a tablet with an edge gnawed by centuries. The wedges whisper under the lamp lists of offerings, months that smell like barley, attacks of fish. On another, a god's complaint about noise, the city too busy for sleep, precedes a flood of correction. You love that even reprimands have paperwork. In a glass aside, a copy of tablet Themain refrains from theatrics. It simply is. Lines like river reeds leaning in one direction, the rhythm of a man telling another man that he built the thing and it worked, and then he was old and far away. Historians still argue whether the Utnapishtim episode borrowed from Atrahasis wholesale or borrowed, then renovated, or if both drew from an older pool of stories that lived in mouths before they learned tablets, and whether flood debris found at one site equals the flood remembered by everyone, or only a local problem woven into a grander rug. They also argue whether that 19th century reading room theatrics Smith's reported excitement started a modern habit of making headlines out of old clay, or whether that habit was already thriving in marble halls with other ruins. The soot drum, prizing boredom, continues to write a flat line as if to model ideal scholarship. A less attested newsroom story winks a colleague insisted that when a Smith recognized the flood lines, he threw his coat, then his vest, then may have considered further disrobing before decorum reclaimed him. Charming, colorful, disputed by those who like colors. You keep only the essence someone felt a text lift from wedge marks into breath and could not help but act like a bell that rings once. Attendance? Yes, then quiet. You let your fingers practice the signature knot in air over, under, through, because someone will shortly ask you to tie a bundle of labeled bags closed, and your theory of civilization continues to be help with rope. A student sets a dish of wet sponges near the table to keep humidity mannered. The clay approves by not cracking. For your second soft joke, you design a climate control mode called Monsoon, Museum Edition. We will be late on purpose, drink water, admire steps you won't use, and the dehumidifier, if it had feelings, would feel seen. Your steady fact walks you briefly down the riverbank. The Tigris and Euphrates change their minds a lot. Levees sleep and wake. Banks slide a little. Someone's garden becomes someone else's sandbar. Cities here kept threshold high and temples on artificial hills. They wrote the year names as headlines of notable events. The year the canal was dug. The year the city was belted. Flood, in this grammar, is a recurring character, not a guest star. You think of the steps at the shore temple, letting water rehearse, and the gate, back in that river mouth, humming a monk vowel while the tide practiced being civilized. Historians still argue whether Plato's tidy day and night had any drop of this river in it via Solon's alleged conversations or later hearsay, whether the moral order of one tale shook hands with the hydraulic caution of another, whether our need to connect them is a map-colored ambition that forgets how a story is traveled by manners more than by roots. The lamp lowers itself by a degree. Your breath answers. The shelf stays loyal to quiet. A child of the dig staff pads in with the clay bull she has made, holds it under the lamp like a petition, and waits to be seen. The conservator, who is wise, says, "Perfect," and then tucks it on a windowsill where breezes can pretend to fire it. For your third soft joke, you propose a museum wing called Provisional, where all charming, unverified things rest under gentle lights with labels that read, "Perhaps," and "We love you," and the tablets, who understand the dignity of drafts, seem to approve. In a case near the door, a map of the old floodplain ink over satellite texture shows ghost channels braiding across land like veins under a skin. Your finger hovers, not touching, only reading over a reach labeled with an ancient town you have learned to say softly. You remember your pencil dot at sea, rubbed to a ghost, your ring in sand smoothed by a captain's palm, your millimeter friend on a key reporting still rising, still calm. Here the ghost is a river that moved its shoulder and never apologized, leaving a line on clay that later became a sentence about a starting over. A less attested local whisper sits down with your jar of not tea. Elders say that, in deep summer, when the river falls away and cracked flats blink like startled eyes, you can smell the old march of water under the dust, a low sweetness that carries faint fish and thyme. Charming, unverified, your jar, sympathizing professionally with layers, produces no comment beyond behaving itself. The conservator slides one more drawer seal impressions, tiny bulls, boats, gods with friendly hats pressed into clay to sign shipments. You picture an entire bureaucracy that never once had to say scroll down, and your shoulders loosen by one notch, grateful for economies that made small noises. At the back of the tray, a bead with a hole becomes a moon if you let it. You step outside for dark that tastes of baked earth and river, a different teaspoon of iron than harbors. Still honest, and here a distant donkey produced the exact clunk you've been collecting across continents, attendants across species. A star sits fat and steady low in the south, Suhail's cousin, while the north one keeps its watch. Somewhere, the sea you left a few days back is making itself linen smooth. Somewhere, a fog listens for a bell. Somewhere, a gate hums. Somewhere, dolphins on a wall continue their lifetime of still motion. You rest your palm on a mud brick lightly, not to push, only to promise, and the brick returns the day's heat for one beat before becoming politely forgetful. You carry inside the lay of wedges under a lamp, a drawer that closed without a click, 2 rumors that behaved themselves, and a slow idea that flood, is a verb in many languages and a character who prefers ensemble casts. Your breath keeps the metronome sh. As you walk along a wall that learned to look like riverbank, and a line you've been reading all night becomes this lovely, not a coastline. You turn toward a city where commentators will add footnotes with quills, where margins will widen like beds for restless rivers, and where bells know exactly how many times to ring. Night folds into the shape of a courtyard, and the air cools enough to feel like a clean page laid over your skin. You step through a low door where the smell is beeswax, leather thongs, and the polished calm of wood that has learned how to hold books. A single lamp throws a gold pool over a desk. The light travels across parchment with the same tide you watched on papyrus and press sheets and tide ledgers. The same ripple the fan at home rehearsed for you. Quills scratch like soft rain. Somewhere far down the cloister, a bell offers one exact syllable attendance and goes to bed. Your chest keeps the meter ch, and the desk returns your palm's warmth for one beat before responsibly forgetting you. The scribe's hand works in the narrow dance lift, tilt, breathe, place. The ink smells faintly of gall and iron your harbor teaspoon, and the letters sit down in ranks as civilized as a key full of amphorae. You hover over the margin, not touching, only promising, and see a thin river of commentary running beside the text. The Escolia, like a whispering audience, offering courtesies, complaints, and helpful gossip. You find the old philosopher's name in the first line and feel the drawer in your chest stop short of a click, exactly like Critias did when it let the last sentence evaporate into air. The unfinished edge is a familiar friend in a room built to finish things. Your steady fact sits up in the lamplight and speaks in the level tone of librarians. Byzantine scribes kept the classical Greek world breathing, copying texts into the new minuscule script from the 9th century onward, annotating, excerpting, filing. The Bibliotheca of Photius in the 9th century summarized hundreds of books, a lighthouse for works that later sank. The Suda, a 10th century encyclopedia, folded authors and words into one obedient volume. Monasteries from Constantinople to Mount Athos trained hands that could keep a sentence alive for 1,000 years. Your breath approves, the way it approved of Roman concrete and Cretan breezeways and a gate that hummed the monk vowel like a lullaby in steel. The quill lifts. A hairline of ink trembles at the nib. The scribe blots with a square of wool before the dot can think of wandering. For your first soft joke, you imagine a monastic app called Escolia, which pings you at midnight. You have 8 margins unset, consider restraint, and then goes on silent mode until lauds, 5 stars, scarce battery use, excellent boundaries. The scribe, who cannot possibly hear you, obeys anyway and lets the margin keep its quiet. A reader in the next stall turns a page with 2 fingers and a breath like a cat stepping from sunny tile into shade. The parchment crackles the way fog did around a chart, the way a tide ledger whispers when your pencil arrives with good manners. On this leaf, a tidy hand has penned a note beside the philosopher's island, a gloss that tries on a voice allegory of pride. It says in Greek, so polite you can taste olive oil in the syntax. The pressman's ghost from another century leans in and pencils moral not topographic across time, then goes back to drawing proofs that clap quietly in orderly stacks. Historians still argue whether the story of the drowned island had much of a career in Byzantium, read as caution and shelved, or ignored as pagan ornament, or whether certain circles kept a lively interest that later traveled west with refugees and books after the city's great fall. They also argue whether the broken edge of Critias was inherited already lost long before these desks, or whether a Byzantine exemplar with a missing quire sentenced it to permanent unfinishedness. The debates drift down the cloister with the lamp smoke. The bell does not ring to decide. A less attested scribal legend pads in on felt shoes in one monastery copy of A Philosopher. They say, a bored rubricator tucked a tiny ringed harbor into the red initial 2 canals and a bridge the size of a smile, only to scrape it off in fear when the abbot passed. Charming? Unverified, you nudge it onto your shelf beside drowned plaza bells. The Sais lamp that supposedly never misbehaved, the lava cave's monk note, the ornamental O with a secret harbor, and your jar of not tea that likes to clarify when you forget it on a windowsill. Still, you watch tonight's rubricator load red into his pen, and you could swear the letter curves like a shoreline, then thinks better of it. The desk wood is cool where the edge hides its grain under varnish. A page lies half ruled, lines pricked with a stylus so faint they are mostly intention. The scribe's knife kisses a goose quill into a clean nib. A hair falls from the brush and gets lifted with tweezers into oblivion. For your second soft joke, you invent a service called Copy and Calm, guaranteed delivery 7 leaves per night. Or we send a cat, then immediately withdraw the offer, because cats deliver what they want and the world sleeps better that way. A real cat, Byzantine by citizenship and global by philosophy, curls into a heap on a coil of spare thongs and pretends not to supervise. Your steady fact shifts chairs and keeps you honest. The minuscule script, compact, rounded, economical, became the Byzantine standard. It saved a space, saved time, and made marginal talk more feasible. Palimpsests, older texts, scraped and overwritten lived here. To thrift that sometimes hid treasures and sometimes simply proved that parchment is patient. Later, humanists from the West came east to read and copy, carrying home the warm smell of beeswax and the cooler fever of Old Greek. Centuries of hands wrote a bridge without knowing its name. Historians still argue whether particular manuscripts of the philosopher originated in Constantinople proper, in provincial houses, or later in Crete and Venice, whether certain marginal notes reflect unique local teaching or echo lost commentaries, whether a scribal family at the capital standardized the text to a degree that turned variants into orphans. They also wonder how often copyists read for sense versus reading for letter, and how many smiled at a rhetorical island while keeping their eyes on the rubric schedule. The quill scratches a line that sounds like rain agreeing with a roof. A less attested human story slips its note under the blotter, a 12th century colophon in a book, not unlike this is said to mutter. The cold is unbearable, my fingers are numb. Pray for the copyist, which feels true in any city where a stone keeps winter. Charming, attested in spirit, if not exactly here. You warm your own fingers on your cup cinnamon again. Who is doing this? and send a prayer backward just in case. In the far apse, a mosaic watches with gold glass that looks like small fires. It reflects a scribe's lamp into the aisle, where it ripples over a case of bindings, wooden boards in leather, raised cords like vertebrae. You trail your hand through the air an inch above the spines, the way you traced ripples in Sais and dolphins on plaster, and the tide staff's wet numbers and the gate's iron shoulder. Your diploma in not touching has had a full and productive life. For your third soft joke, you propose a Byzantine fragrance, eau de scriptorium, notes of beeswax, lamp smoke, quiet competitiveness, and imagine a line extension called millimeter, which smells like brass page rulers and calm. You would absolutely give one to the Tide staff if it had a dresser. The cat endorses the product by blinking once. The feline version of a notarized stamp. A reader closes a codex the way a drawer closes without a click. The thongs lie down. The wood forgets your heat. A young monk lifts a leaf to daylight and studies the watermarks, little ox heads and towers that float like clouds borrowed by paper. He points to a marginal note. Someone, long ago, wrote of morals, not coasts, and you feel a cross-century handshake with that pressman's pencil, with the map room where you rubbed a dot into a ghost, with the sand tray under lattice where a captain smoothed a ring away with his palm. Lovely, not a coastline. Historians still argue whether Byzantine readers approached the philosopher's island as a cousin to Genesis floods and moral cities, or as a politely shelved antique respected, not imitated. They also argue whether a few late Byzantine Platonists, Gemistos Plethon, will saunter onto another estate, tilted old texts toward fresh civic dreams that would soon bloom in Italian gardens, and whether that tilt had any room for ringed islands and processional bridges, or preferred its maps of mind. The bell keeps its one note, the cat keeps its coil, the page keeps its breath. The lamp's flame dips, steadies. The quill takes a stroke and lays its fatigue on wool. A thin glass cup carries water like a small miracle. When the scribe drinks, you hear the exact clonk of a well-behaved bell in a bookshop door, and a barge fender and a goat bell under a tamarisk. Attendance is everywhere, sufficiently marked. Your jar of not tea in your bag remembers its layers with professional calm. You tie a loose bundle of offcuts for the binder with your signature knot, over, under, through, and the cord hums the monk vowel so small that only ribs can hear it. Oh. The scribe thanks you with an eyebrow, the most Byzantine of gratuities. You lay 2 fingers on the desk, not to push, only to promise, and the wood gives you a final grain of coolness before going back to being furniture, which is the highest calling furniture knows. Outside, a courtyard keeps oranges under leaves that shine like well-rubbed leather. A cistern takes one quiet sip and then acts as if nothing happened. Far away, water puts its shoulder on the Bosporus and moves a city by millimeters no eye will notice. You think of gates that hum, dolphins that stay in motion while standing still, steps to nowhere that take water seriously, and bells that ring once and then respect the hour. You think of a broken sentence that has taught whole libraries how to be comfortable with gentleness. You walk under an arch where a mosaic hand raises 2 fingers in blessing the same gesture you make on rails and posts when you promise without pressing. The street smells of damp stone and sesame and a thread of iron in the air that honest harbors taught you to love. The city's skin is cool by a degree your cheekbones can measure. You carry forward the sound of quills like rain, the gloss of beeswax on wood, a margin that knows when to stop, an unfinished page that sleeps well anyway, and a cat who notarized the evening with a blink. Down the hill, a pier waits. Past that, a road finds the coast. Past that, water remembers how to write in long, patient sentences no one needs to read aloud. Night greets you with cool wood and small lights, and the pier keeps a memory of the day in its grain while lending only the comfortable temperature to your palms. The harbor has learned to whisper. Water folds under the ladder with that mild itch. You've been practicing since the map on your blanket first pretended to be a moonlit sea. A bell toward the mouth gives one exact syllable, attendance, and then, like every courteous bell you've met from Sais to the Celtic fog, rests. Your signature knot over, under, through tames a coil by the cleat and hums the monk vowel into the line. Your surname answers automatically. Proof that rope and ribs have signed a non-aggression pact. Masts write graphite lines on the low sky. The planks smell of tar, iron, and a rumor of cinnamon that refuses to retire from this series. You lean on the rail not to push, only to promise, and the wood returns a little warmth and then forgets you, the way good furniture and better oceans do. Down channel, a gate shoulder hums, the same note you heard, where the river practiced rising between a stone and schedule. A buoy blinks like a careful metronome. Somewhere behind you, a shop door, maybe even a bookshop, with a cat tries a tiny clonk and closes without a click. Your steady fact laces itself to the pier with plain confidence after 1453, when Constantinople fell and scholars carried Greek manuscripts west. Plato's pages found new desks in Italian rooms. Within decades, humanists were reading those dialogues aloud, while printers, Venice, Florence, Basel, turned lamplit copies into press-lit sheets. At nearly the same time, pilots used portolan cards, those wind-starred maps, with room lines and the magnetic compass to cross and recross the Atlantic's edges. Early modern globes and mappae showed St. Brendan's Isle, Antillia, and Hy-Brasil lingering like polite guests at the border of known water, islands sometimes made of ink, sometimes of hope, sometimes of weather. You picture a printer eyeing his title page, the way your pressman once penciled moral, not topographic, and deciding against a decorative archipelago for the initial O. For your first a soft joke, you imagine a dockside kiosk labeled Lost and Found, Atlantic Division holding a basket of neatly tagged maybes, one ringed City Ghosted, 2 bells ring once, assorted mirages return on sunny days, 5 stars for organization, no refunds on fog. Historians still argue whether early voyagers took those painted isles as navigational prompts, true targets to aim for, or as ornaments to entertain sponsors. Whether the island of the 7 cities, Antillia, shaped routes or merely shaped daydreams on deck. They also argue how much Renaissance enthusiasm for Plato's island ode to allegory read seriously versus a fresh taste for antiquity's glitter, and whether big new coasts tempted readers to treat a moral as a map. The water declines to adjudicate. It signs the dark with quiet parentheses and leaves the sentence to you. A less attested Azores rumor sits down on your coil and arranges its cuffs, lighthouse keepers, on Flores. It says, once heard on certain nights when the wind forgot itself, a single deep note under the swell, as if a lost harbor checked in. Charming, unverified, you file it beside a drowned Plaza Vespers, Says's tireless lamp, the cave bell, the ornamental O with a secret harbor, and that governor's ban on Atlantis at dinner because conversation improved. Still, your ribs concede a syllable from somewhere out beyond the bar, and your shoulders lower by one measured notch on the private-tied staff you now carry under your collarbone. A skiff kisses a fender with the good clonk you collect the way other people collect stamps. A deckhand tosses a line, your hands put the knot where knots would most like to be, and the rope purrs its vow of fidelity. A child on the gangway counts the stars as if they have invoices, and the parent corrects gently, showing the child a rising asterism with a finger that knows how to point and not poke. You remember the captain under the lattice drawing a ring into sand and smoothing it back into a ghost, a ritual for sleeping well while keeping the shape. The pier light paints a coin-bright path on the chop and erases it, paints it and erases, patient as a scribe's blotter. For your second soft joke, you invent a bedtime app called One Bell that rings exactly once and then refuses to do anything else while you drift off out of admiration for its boundaries. Permissive permissions, no ads, life-changing minimalism. Your jar of natilla waits in your bag, layers obedient under the moon. You imagine opening it and letting the air here do its quiet work on the surface, clarify, settle, move light without spilling, and you decide that jars deserve home routines even when harbors are persuasive. Somewhere a gull performs its managerial walk on a mooring rope and pretends to trip for applause. You offer the approved amount of applause and put your hands back in your pockets, which smell faintly of thyme and lamp smoke and press ink you still haven't confessed to anyone. Historians still argue whether the Portolan tradition sprang from a single workshop's genius or from many pilots' a shared practice, whether Peary Race's famous 1513 world chart stitched new Atlantic coasts to older rumors or cleaned them, whether modern erasures of phantom islands owe more to hydrographic crews sounding lanes or to satellites flattening wonder into confidence. They also argue if the long popularity of Atlantis in the centuries after the presses ignited by earnest compilations and later by best-selling imaginations helped people sleep or kept them up measuring proofs against waves. The buoy blinks, the gate hums. The pier suggests you let these arguments keep office hours that do not include your pillow. For your third soft joke, you promote yourself, quietly and without pay, to assistant harbor master, night shift, with duties limited to approving millimeters and refusing to shout. You perform your only task touching the rail not to push, only to promise, and the rail returns a thin warmth and then forgets you entirely. Excellent management on all sides. A breeze arrives by exactly 1 degree. The bay changes its mind about texture and then apologizes by shining. The moon lays a seam down the channel like the lamp on your first map. And for a moment, you see every place that joined you for this walk moving in that seam, the rule of light across the sea floor. Dolphins in a plaster tide, unbothered by time, clay boats forever tilted on kiln-made swells, a gate's monk vowel, a soot drum's mercifully boring line, a proofreader's pencil refusing to map a moral, a satellite print with a dot rubbed into a ghost, steps to nowhere accepting a wave with hospitality, a lattice throwing shadows like small sails. None of them demands a verdict. All of them know how to be present and then yield to background. A cat arrives out of nothing and scolds a coil into an even better circle, which is mentorship. You give the cat honorary rank and it withholds thanks in accordance with tradition. Far down the quay, a barge rumbles the vowels the river taught it. Your breath answers, ugh. And the pier returns each footfall like bread remembering the oven. You pocket an invisible pencil and write in air where only you can see it lovely, not a coastline. The night signs the note with salt, iron on your tongue, a mutter of a cinnamon that probably belongs to someone's kitchen, and the single perfect ring of a bell deciding that once is enough. Your knot learns the shape of sleep. Your shoulders salute themselves under a sky that knows how to keep, and the harbor finishes the day without applause because that is the style here, patient, precise, present, then politely gone. Let the boards of the pier become softer underfoot, and then, with each breath, softer still until they are not boards at all, but a kind of dark, steady water that holds you without asking questions. Let your shoulders be tied lightly. With that calm little knot, your hands know nothing tight, nothing urgent, just enough to let the muscles rest where they belong. Listen for the one bell that has already rung, and feel how the silence after it is not empty, but full of permission, full of the quieting that follows when roll is called and everyone is counted, and no one has to volunteer for anything more. Let your breathing lengthen like a lantern's reflection sliding farther down the bay until the inhale reaches you as softly as a moth that has decided to be careful, and the exhale goes out like a drawer that slides closed without a click. If a thought arrives, set it gently on the rail and feel the rail return a little warmth and then kindly forget it. Imagine the map you started with, folded along its friendly crease, the ripple of light across it dimming to a pale seam, then to a memory of a seam, then to the quiet weight of paper that does not need to be read tonight. Let the sounds around you drop away one by one, rope hum, gate vowel, the far thrum of a patient barge until they are a single background breath that you don't have to keep track of because it keeps track of you. The air cools by a degree you recognize, the way evening always does when it is finished being important and is ready to become helpful. Your hands loosen, your jaw softens, your eyes grow heavy in the nicest way, and somewhere a cat settles into a better circle and the night approves. The harbor keeps the watch. The stars do the counting. Sleep comes aboard and ties a very gentle knot.